Welcome back to another journey through history's quieter corners, where we explore the past, not for its grand moments, but for its everyday truths. Tonight, we're stepping into the cobblestone streets of revolutionary France, where the air itself seemed to crackle with change and uncertainty. You might think you would have thrived during the French Revolution. Perhaps you believe in equality, in the rights of common people, in overthrowing corrupt systems. You might imagine yourself cheering as the Bastille fell, nodding approvingly as aristocrats faced justice. But here's the unsettling truth that history whispers to us across the centuries. In revolutionary France, your beliefs mattered less than you might think. Your survival often depended not on what you believed, but on who you knew, where you lived, what you said yesterday, and who happened to be listening. The French Revolution was not a single event, but a cascade of transformations that swept through every corner of French society between 1789 and 1799. It was a time when a baker could become a politician, when a nobleman could lose his head for crimes he never committed, and when the very concept of daily life was torn apart and reconstructed. Almost daily, the revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it delivered something far more complex and far more dangerous. Tonight, we'll walk through four distinct but interconnected aspects of this extraordinary period. We'll begin in the narrow streets of Paris during the Terror, feeling the weight of suspicion that pressed down on ordinary citizens as they waited in red lines and wondered if their neighbors were writing down their names. We'll follow the rise and dramatic fall of Maximilien Robespierre, the man who embodied the revolution's ideals and its contradictions. We'll explore the famous Bastille prison, separating myth from reality in that symbol of oppression. And finally, we'll examine how a revolution that began by condemning privilege ended by creating new forms of elite power. Wrapped in the language of equality, so settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to discover why surviving the French Revolution required not just the right beliefs, but the right timing, the right connections, and above all, the right kind of luck. Imagine yourself waking in a cramped apartment on the third floor of a building in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, one of Paris's working-class districts, in the winter of 1794. The year itself carries weight, year 2 of the Republic, as the revolutionary calendar now demands you call it. The wooden shutters rattle against the January wind, and frost has formed delicate patterns on the inside of your single window. You can hear the sounds of the city awakening, the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones, the creak of cartwheels, and somewhere in the distance, the steady rhythm of the guillotine being prepared for another day's work. Your first thought upon waking is not of politics or revolution, but of bread. It has been 3 days since you last tasted meat, and even the coarse brown bread that forms the backbone of your diet has become increasingly difficult to obtain. The government has established maximum prices for essential goods, the maximum, they call it, but this has only made merchants more reluctant to sell, and the black market prices have soared beyond the reach of ordinary citizens like yourself. You dress quickly in the dim light filtering through your frost-covered window. Your clothes are practical, worn, a rough woolen shirt, patched trousers, and a jacket that has seen better seasons. The red bonnet of liberty sits on your table. Not wearing it in public would mark you as suspect, but wearing it too enthusiastically might also draw unwanted attention. This is the delicate balance that defines life during the Terror. Appearing revolutionary enough to avoid suspicion, but not so revolutionary as to be noticed. The hallway outside your apartment echoes with hushed conversations. Madame Rousseau from the second floor nods to you cautiously. Her husband was taken away 2 weeks ago, not for any crime, but because someone reported that he had spoken favorably of the old days when bread was more plentiful. She hasn't heard from him since, and the dark circles under her eyes tell the story of sleepless nights spent wondering if he's still alive. You want to offer comfort. But in these times, even kindness can be interpreted as conspiracy. The streets of your neighborhood are alive with activity, but it's a nervous, watchful kind of energy. Groups of citizens gather at corners, their conversations, stopping abruptly when strangers approach. The section your local revolutionary government has posted new notices on the walls overnight. You pause to read them, not because you're particularly interested, but because failing to show interest in revolutionary proclamations could be noted by the ever-present observers. Today's notices include a list of new enemies of the people. Some names you recognize, others are complete strangers. There's also an announcement about increased vigilance against counter-revolutionary activities, a reminder about the importance of denouncing suspicious behavior, and new regulations about the distribution of grain. The language is urgent, filled with references to the nation's enemies and the need for revolutionary purity. But after months of such proclamations, the words begin to blur together into a constant background hum of threat and exhortation. The bread line stretches for 3 blocks down the Rue de Lappe. You take your place behind a carpenter whose hands are stained with wood polish and a woman whose infant cries weakly against her chest. The line moves slowly, and you have perhaps 2 hours to wait before reaching the baker's door. This gives you time to observe, to listen, and to be very careful about what you say. The conversations around you are a masterclass in coded language. No one speaks directly about hunger, though the hollow cheeks and warm clothing of your fellow citizens tell the story plainly enough. Instead, people discuss the weather, the latest revolutionary festivals, and the great victories of French armies against the enemies of the Republic. But underneath these safe topics, you can hear the real concerns. Where can one find meat? Has anyone heard news of the Girondins who were arrested last month? Did the baker on Rue St. Paul really have his shop closed for counter-revolutionary pricing? Standing 2 places ahead of you is Jean Baptiste, a blacksmith you've known for years. Before the revolution, he was known for his honest work and his occasional complaints about taxes. Now he wears his revolutionary credentials like armor. He speaks loudly about the need to purge France of its enemies. He volunteers for neighborhood watch duty, and he's been seen at the public executions, cheering with apparent enthusiasm. But you notice how his hands shake when he thinks no one is looking, and how his eyes dart nervously when anyone mentions the Committee of Public Safety. Woman behind you whispers to her companion about her brother, who worked as a clerk for a merchant family before the revolution. The family fled to Austria, but her brother remained, thinking his humble position would protect him. Last week, he was denounced as an accomplice to emigres and taken to the Luxembourg prison. She doesn't know if he's still alive, but she's heard that conditions in the prisons have become unspeakable. Hundreds of suspected counter-revolutionaries are packed into spaces meant for dozens, with little food, no heat, and the constant knowledge that each day might bring their name to the tribunal. As you inch forward in the bread line, you become aware of the delicate social choreography that has evolved during these months of the terror. People position themselves carefully, neither too close nor too far from others, maintaining the precise distance that suggests solidarity without intimacy. Conversations are loud enough to be overheard. Privacy itself has become suspicious, but generic enough to avoid providing ammunition for denunciations. The baker, when you finally reach his shop, is a thin man with flour-dusted aprons and eyes that have seen too much. He weighs your bread carefully, precisely, neither giving nor taking an extra gram. His prices are set by law, but the quality of his bread has steadily declined as good flour becomes harder to obtain. The loaf you receive is darker than bread used to be, coarser, with a texture that speaks of substitutions and shortages. But it's bread, and in these times, that's enough. On your way home, you pass the local section headquarters, where citizens are required to register their activities and report any suspicious behavior they've witnessed. The building buzzes with activity people, coming and going, some voluntarily, others clearly reluctant. Through the open doorway, you can see the massive ledgers where every citizen's name is recorded, along with notes about their political reliability, their attendance at revolutionary events, and any comments that might suggest counter-revolutionary. Sympathies. The section secretary, Citizen Fausch, stands in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the street. He's a man who has risen from obscurity to significant local power through his zealous devotion to revolutionary purity. Before the revolution, he was a minor clerk. Now he holds the power of life and death over his neighbors. His gaze meets yours briefly, and you offer the proper revolutionary greeting, salut et fraternit, while trying to project the right balance of enthusiasm and respect. Inside your building, you encounter another resident, Pierre, who worked as a valet for an aristocratic family before the revolution. He's been trying to reinvent himself as a committed Republican, but his manner of speaking, his posture, even his way of eating bread betrays his years of service in an aristocratic household. He's grown increasingly nervous as the months pass, aware that his past makes him vulnerable to denunciation. You exchange brief pleasantries, but both of you are conscious of the unspoken tension got back in your apartment. You eat your bread slowly, making it last. The taste is heavy, dense, filling, but not satisfying. As you eat, you think about the strange transformation that has overtaken your city, your country, your life. 3 years ago, you supported the revolution enthusiastically. You cheered when the Bastille fell. You approved when the nobles were stripped of their privileges. You nodded approvingly when the king was executed. You believed in the promise of equality, in the idea that common people like yourself could finally have a voice in how France was governed. But somewhere along the way, the revolution began to consume not just its enemies, but its supporters. As well, the definition of who qualified as an enemy grew broader and more unpredictable with each passing month. First, it was the aristocrats and the priests who refused to take the revolutionary oath. Then it was the moderate revolutionaries, who were deemed insufficiently radical. Then it was anyone who had ever expressed doubt about any revolutionary policy, anyone who had ever been friendly with someone who was now considered an enemy, anyone whose revolutionary enthusiasm was judged to be inadequate or insincere. Evening brings new sounds to your neighborhood. The tramp of feet as citizens are marched to prison, the raised voices of impromptu political meetings, the nervous laughter of people trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy in decidedly abnormal times. From your window, you can see lights in the section headquarters, where the work of revolution continues long into the night. Lists are being compiled. Decisions are being made about who will be investigated next, who will be arrested, who will be allowed to continue their precarious existence as citizens of the Republic. You think about Madame Rousseau downstairs, alone now and afraid. You think about Jean-Baptiste the blacksmith, whose revolutionary fervor masks a terror that grows deeper each day. You think about Pierre, the former valet, whose past hangs over him like a sword. And you think about yourself, trying to navigate a world where the wrong word, the wrong association, the wrong expression on your face could mean the difference. Between life and death. The irony is inescapable. You still believe in the ideals that launched the revolution. You still think France is better off without kings and nobles, still support the idea that all citizens should be equal before the law, still hope for a society where merit matters more than birth. But believing in the revolution's goals has become almost irrelevant to surviving the revolution's reality. What matters now is not what you believe, but how well you can perform the role of a proper revolutionary citizen, how successfully you can navigate the constantly shifting definitions of political orthodoxy, and how effectively you can avoid the attention of those who have the power to destroy you. As you prepare for sleep, you perform the small rituals that have become second nature during these months of the terror. You check that your red bonnet is positioned where it can be easily seen. You review in your mind the conversations you had today, analyzing whether you said anything that could be misinterpreted or used against you. You think about tomorrow's challenges, the bread line again, the careful navigation of neighborhood politics, the constant vigilance required to present yourself as a good citizen while avoiding the spotlight that brings danger. Tomorrow, you know, will bring new lists of enemies, new reasons for fear, new opportunities for someone to misinterpret your words or actions. But tonight, in the darkness of your small room, you allow yourself a moment of honest reflection on the revolution that promised to liberate you, but has instead imprisoned you in a web of suspicion and fear that seems to grow tighter with each passing day. The morning of your fourth day in this revolutionary winter arrives with the sound of drums echoing through the narrow streets. It's not the cheerful rhythm of a festival, but the measured, somber beat that announces another public execution. You lie in your bed for a moment longer than usual, listening to the sound grow louder as the procession makes its way toward the Place de la Revolution. The drums are accompanied by the shuffle of feet hundreds, perhaps thousands of citizens who will witness today's spectacle of revolutionary justice. You know you should attend. Absence from public executions has become noted, recorded, interpreted as possible sympathy for the enemies of the people. The section keeps informal tallies of who appears at these civic duties and who does not. But something in you rebels against the thought of watching more lives end, even if those lives belong to people designated as traitors to the Republic. Still, you dress and prepare to join the crowd, because in this new world, your personal feelings matter far less than your public demonstrations of loyalty. The streets leading to the Place de la Revolution are filled with your fellow citizens, all wearing the required symbols of Republican virtue. Red bonnets, tricolor cockades, and simple clothing that proclaims allegiance to equality. But if you look closely, and you've learned to look very closely indeed, you can see the subtle variations that tell deeper stories. Some wear their revolutionary symbols with genuine pride, others with careful performance, and still others with barely concealed terror. Marie, the seamstress from your building, walks beside you toward the execution ground. Her husband was a minor clerk in the old royal administration, a position that now makes their entire family suspect, despite his death from fever 2 years ago. She attends every public execution, cheers at the appropriate moments, and has even volunteered to sew banners for revolutionary festivals. But you notice how she touches her chest sometimes, and you suspect she's hidden away some small token from the old world, perhaps a religious medal or a piece of jewelry that belonged to her grandmother. Such items could mean death if discovered, but some people cannot quite bring themselves to destroy every connection to the life they knew before. The crowd around the guillotine is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, fear sweat, and the metallic tongue that seems to hang in the air around the scaffold. The machine itself has become as familiar as any landmark in Paris, its triangular frame rising against the gray winter sky like some grim monument to revolutionary efficiency. The executioner Sanson moves with practiced professionalism, checking the blade, testing the mechanism, preparing for the day's work with the same methodical attention a baker might give to preparing his ovens. Today's condemned include a former nobleman, 2 priests who refused to take the constitutional oath, a merchant accused of hoarding grain, and most unsettling of all, a young woman whose crime appears to be nothing more than having been born into the wrong family. She cannot be more than 20, and as she's led to the scaffold, her composure strikes you as both admirable and heartbreaking. She looks out over the crowd, not with defiance or terror, but with a kind of sad bewilderment, as if she's trying to understand how the world changed so completely while she wasn't paying attention. The crowd's reaction to each execution follows a predictable pattern. Enthusiastic cheers greet the deaths of the nobleman and the grain merchant. These are enemies the people can understand and hate. The priests receive a more muted response. Many in the crowd retain some residual respect for the clergy, even if they've embraced the revolution's anti-clerical policies. But when the young woman's turn comes, an uncomfortable near silence falls over the assembly. Her death seems to satisfy no one's sense of justice, yet no one dares to object or even look away. After the executions, the crowd disperses with the peculiar mixture of excitement and unease that has become characteristic of these public spectacles. Some citizens linger to discuss the proceedings, analyzing the crimes of the condemned and expressing satisfaction at the Republic's vigilance against its enemies. Others hurry away quickly, as if trying to escape not just the physical scene, but the memory of what they've witnessed. You find yourself walking home beside Francois, a carpenter who lives in your district. Before the revolution, he was known for his skill with wood and his quiet, steady temperament. Now he serves on the Neighborhood Surveillance Committee, tasked with monitoring the political reliability of his fellow citizens. The transformation has been dramatic. Where once he spoke little and worked much, now he talks constantly about revolutionary politics and seems to watch everyone with suspicious eyes. That grain merchant got what he deserved, Francois says as you walk. Hoarding food while the people starve, that's worse than murder. His voice carries the righteous anger that has become the approved emotional register for discussing enemies of the Republic. But you notice how his hands shake slightly as he speaks. You wonder if he truly believes what he's saying, or if he's simply repeating the phrases that have become necessary for survival. The conversation turns to neighborhood matters. Francois mentions that the butcher on Rue de Charon has been asking questions about meat rations, suggesting that perhaps the citizens are not receiving their fair share. He says this casually, but you understand the implication. The butcher is being watched, his complaints noted, his loyalty questioned. In the old world, a butcher complaining about meat supplies would have been seen as a businessman protecting his trade. In the new world, such complaints can be interpreted as criticism of the Republic's ability to feed its people, a short step from counter-revolutionary sentiment. We must all be vigilant, Francois continues, and the phrase has become so common that it's almost meaningless, except that it isn't meaningless at all. It's a reminder, a warning, a statement of the new social contract that governs daily life. Everyone must watch everyone else. Trust has become not just difficult, but dangerous. Even family members have been known to denounce each other when political pressure becomes too intense, or when personal grievances seek revolutionary outlets not back in your building. You encounter old citizen Moreau, who was a philosophy teacher. Before the revolution, closed most of the schools. He's struggling with a heavy sack of coal, and you instinctively move to help him, but he waves you away with a gesture that's almost panic. "I can manage," he says quickly. "I don't need assistance." Only later do you understand his reaction. Accepting help could be interpreted as forming suspicious associations, and being seen as too friendly with neighbors might suggest conspiracy. The isolation that has settled over daily life is perhaps more corrosive than the fear itself. People who once shared meals, borrowed tools, celebrated together, and mourned together now maintain careful distances. Community has been replaced by surveillance, and friendship has become a luxury too dangerous to afford. The revolution promised fraternity, but it has delivered a society where brothers regard each other with suspicion. In your apartment, you prepare your meager evening meal and think about the reports you've heard from other districts of Paris. The Faubourg Saint-Germain, once home to the aristocracy, now houses revolutionary officials who have moved into mansions confiscated from émigré nobles. The buildings remain elegant, but their new occupants are learning to navigate the peculiar challenges of appearing revolutionary while enjoying unprecedented comfort. Too much luxury might suggest corruption. Too little might suggest insufficient. Commitment to claiming the Republic's rightful inheritance from its defeated enemies, the Latin Quarter, home to students and intellectuals, has become a particularly dangerous place for anyone whose education might be interpreted as aristocratic. Pretension. University professors have been arrested for using classical references in their speech, and students have learned to hide their books and speak in the simplified language that suggests proper revolutionary simplicity. Knowledge itself has become suspect, and the ability to read Latin or discuss philosophy marks one as potentially counter-revolutionary. Meanwhile, the working-class districts like your own have become theaters for the performance of revolutionary virtue. Citizens compete to demonstrate their political purity, their devotion to equality, their hatred of the Republic's enemies. But this competition has created its own problems. Those who perform their revolutionary identity too enthusiastically risk being seen as inauthentic, while those who seem insufficiently committed face denunciation and arrest. The evening brings a neighborhood meeting at the section headquarters, attendance at which is theoretically voluntary, but practically mandatory. Citizens gather in the poorly lit main room to discuss local matters, the distribution of rations, the organization of revolutionary festivals, the identification of suspicious behavior within the community. Citizen Faust presides over these meetings with the authority of someone who understands that power in revolutionary Paris comes not from birth or wealth, but from the ability to navigate the constantly shifting currents of political orthodoxy. The conversations in the breadlines have evolved their own coded language. People speak of difficult times rather than starvation, of necessary sacrifices rather than terror, of revolutionary vigilance rather than denunciation and betrayal. Everyone understands these euphemisms, but no one acknowledges the code directly. It's another layer of performance, another way of navigating the gap between public necessity and private truth. One morning, you notice that Jean-Baptiste the blacksmith is not in his usual place in the breadline. At first, you assume he simply arrived earlier or later than usual. But when a full week passes without his appearance, you begin to understand what his absence means. No one speaks of it directly, but the careful way people avoid mentioning his name, the nervous glances toward the space where he used to stand, the subtle shifting of positions to close the gap his absence has created. All of these tell the story of another disappearance, another life swallowed by the revolution's hunger for enemies. The knowledge of Jean-Baptiste's fate, though you never learn the specific charges against him, adds another layer of anxiety to your daily routine. If someone is apparently committed to the revolution as Jean-Baptiste could be taken away, then no one is safe. The criteria for survival become increasingly unclear, increasingly arbitrary. Revolutionary enthusiasm is required, but too much enthusiasm can be seen as performance covering counter-revolutionary sympathies. Poverty demonstrates proper Republican virtue, but too much poverty might suggest counter-revolutionary sabotage. Of the economy, even the timing of your arrival at the breadline becomes a matter for careful consideration. Too early might suggest hoarding. Too late might suggest lack of proper commitment to securing the Republic's resources. The winter deepens, and with it comes new challenges that test the limits of revolutionary solidarity. Coal becomes scarce, and the communal heating arrangements that some buildings have attempted to organize begin to break down under the pressure of mutual suspicion. Sharing resources requires trust, but trust has become a luxury that few can afford. Citizens begin to hoard what little fuel they can obtain, leading to accusations of counter-revolutionary selfishness, which in turn leads to denunciations and arrests that make people even more reluctant to share or cooperate. Your own building becomes a microcosm of these larger tensions. The communal areas that once served as gathering places for informal conversation now feel dangerous spaces where careless words can be overheard and reported. The hallways echo with the sounds of doors closing quickly, of conversations ending abruptly when footsteps approach, of the careful politeness that has replaced genuine neighborly warmth. Madame Rousseau, still waiting for news of her arrested husband, has grown increasingly desperate. She's taken to visiting the section headquarters daily, asking for information about her husband's case, pleading for permission to visit him, or at least to know whether he's still alive. Her persistence has begun to attract attention from citizens. Fauch, who seems to view her inquiries as potential evidence of counter-revolutionary sympathy. The situation creates a cruel paradox. Her love for her husband demonstrates the kind of personal loyalty that revolutionary ideology celebrates, but her refusal to accept his disappearance quietly suggests a lack of proper trust in revolutionary justice. The children in your building have become strange, quiet creatures who seem to understand instinctively that childhood itself has become a kind of performance. They play games that mirror the adult world of surveillance and denunciation, pretending to arrest each other for crimes against the Republic, staging mock trials where dolls and toys are sentenced to death for counter-revolutionary activities. Their laughter has a hollow quality that suggests they're learning lessons about power and fear that no children should need to learn. Pierre, the former aristocratic valet, has developed a nervous condition that makes his hands shake constantly. He's tried to reinvent himself as a committed revolutionary, volunteering for the most menial tasks at section meetings, speaking passionately about equality and the rights of the common people. But his past continues to haunt him, and he seems to understand that his eventual arrest is not a matter of if, but when. He's begun to drink more heavily, which only makes him more conspicuous and more vulnerable to the kind of careless statement that could provide the excuse his enemies need. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance begins to manifest in subtle ways throughout the community. People develop nervous habits, touching their faces, adjusting their clothes, looking over their shoulders, even when no one is following them. Conversations become stilted, formal, filled with the kind of revolutionary phrases that demonstrate proper political consciousness while saying nothing of substance. The spontaneous humor, the casual intimacy, the unguarded moments that once characterized neighborhood life have been replaced by careful performance and mutual WATCHFULNESS. Religious observance, officially forbidden but privately persistent, has gone underground in ways that create their own forms of danger. Some citizens continue to pray in secret, to observe Catholic holidays in the privacy of their homes, to keep hidden religious artifacts as connections to the world that existed before the revolution. But these practices require elaborate secrecy and create networks of shared risk that can become networks of mutual denunciation when pressure is applied. You become aware of these underground religious activities through small signs. The way Madame Dupont crosses herself quickly when she thinks no one is watching. The way certain citizens seem to avoid meat on Fridays, despite the official abolition of Catholic dietary practices. The way some people whisper words that sound like prayers when they think they're alone. But you also become aware of the danger these practices represent, not just to those who engage in them, but to anyone who knows about them and fails to report them. The revolutionary tribunal has become a presence that looms over daily life even for those who never come into direct contact with it. Its procedures, its standards of evidence, its interpretation of what constitutes counter-revolutionary activity, all of these filter down through the community in the form of rumors, warnings, and cautionary tales. The tribunal's definition of treason seems to expand daily, encompassing not just active opposition to the revolution, but insufficient enthusiasm, suspicious associations, and even unlucky coincidences that can be interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. The physical environment of the city begins to reflect the psychological atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Buildings that once housed aristocratic families stand empty, their windows boarded up, their gardens overgrown with weeds. The churches, officially closed and converted to secular purposes, maintain an eerie presence in the urban landscape. The statues of saints have been removed, but their empty niches remain, like missing teeth in the city's smile. The markets, once centers of bustling commercial activity, have become places of nervous transaction where buyers and sellers regard each other with mutual suspicion. The official prices posted by the Maximum seem almost fictional compared to the actual cost of goods. But complaining about prices can be interpreted as criticism of the revolution's economic policies. Merchants who charge too much risk arrest for profiteering. Merchants who charge too little risk suspicion of counter-revolutionary. Attempts to undermine the economy. The rhythm of daily life has become punctuated by the sounds of political activity. The drums that announce executions, the bells that call citizens to mandatory meetings, the marching feet of guards escorting prisoners through the streets. These sounds create a constant background of tension, a reminder that the revolution's work of transformation and purification continues around the clock. Your own survival has become a daily exercise in careful calculation and strategic performance. You've learned to modulate your voice to the proper level of revolutionary enthusiasm, to choose your words carefully, to avoid any phrase that might be interpreted as criticism or doubt, to regulate your facial expressions to suggest the appropriate mixture of dedication and vigilance. The mental effort required for this constant performance is exhausting, but relaxing your guard even for a moment could be fatal. The letters that occasionally arrive from friends or relatives in other parts of France paint a picture of a nation transforming itself through violence and fear. The provincial cities are experiencing their own versions of the terror, with local committees of public safety identifying and eliminating enemies of the Republic. The countryside is swept by rumors of foreign invasion, counter-revolutionary plots, and the need for ever greater vigilance against the forces that would destroy the revolution. Some of these letters arrive opened, their contents clearly examined by authorities who monitor correspondence for signs of counter-revolutionary communication. The knowledge that your private communications are subject to surveillance adds another layer of isolation to daily life. Even the most intimate relationships must be conducted in language that could withstand official scrutiny. Even the most personal expressions of love or concern must be filtered through the vocabulary of revolutionary correctness. The winter nights are long and cold, filled with the sounds of a city that never quite sleeps. The patrols that monitor the streets, the late-night arrests that echo through the buildings, the nervous conversations that continue in whispers behind closed doors, all of these create an atmosphere of constant, low-level anxiety that permeates every aspect of daily existence. You've begun to dream differently, to find that even sleep offers no real escape from the pressures of revolutionary life. Your dreams are filled with trials and tribunals, with neighbors who transform into accusers, with the constant need to justify your existence and prove your loyalty to authorities whose faces you can never quite see clearly. You wake each morning with the feeling that you've been running all night, that sleep itself has become another form of work, another challenge to be survived. The approach of spring brings no relief from the psychological winter that has settled over Paris. If anything, the lengthening days seem to make the surveillance more intense, the scrutiny more constant. The revolution's appetite for enemies appears to be insatiable, and each victory against counter-revolutionary forces seems only to reveal new threats, new categories of suspicious behavior, new reasons for fear and vigilance. As you prepare for another day of breadlines and careful performance, you reflect on how completely your life has been transformed by the revolution's promise of freedom and equality. The freedom you've gained is the freedom to choose how to demonstrate your loyalty to the Republic. The equality you've achieved is the equal vulnerability that all citizens share in the face of arbitrary denunciation and revolutionary justice. These are not the freedoms and equality you imagined when you first cheered the fall of the Bastille, but they are the freedoms and equality that the revolution has actually delivered. The irony is sharp and inescapable. You have become freer and more equal than you ever were under the old regime, but you have never felt less free or more vulnerable. The revolution has succeeded in its promise to transform French society, but the transformation has created new forms of oppression that are in some ways more total and more terrifying than the injustices they replaced. The king's tyranny was distant and impersonal. The revolution's tyranny is intimate and omnipresent, exercised by neighbors and enforced through the very community bonds that once provided comfort and security. And yet, even now, even after months of fear and survival, and the constant performance of revolutionary virtue, you find that you still believe in the ideals that launched the revolution. You still think that common people deserve a voice in their government, that merit should matter more than birth, that the vast inequalities of the old regime were intolerable and had to be destroyed. A tragedy is not that the revolution was wrong in its goals, but that the methods it has chosen to achieve those goals have created new forms of injustice that may be even more destructive than the old ones. This is the burden that you carry as you step out into another day of revolutionary Paris. The knowledge that you are living through a transformation that is both necessary and terrible, both liberating and oppressive, both the fulfillment of humanity's highest ideals and a demonstration of humanity's capacity for cruelty and betrayal. The revolution has taught you that it is possible to believe in freedom while living in terror, to support equality while practicing denunciation, to love justice while fearing its application. These contradictions have become the substance of daily life, the air you breathe, the ground you walk on in the strange new world that the revolution has created got as the daily struggles of ordinary Parisians continued through the harsh winter of 1794. A different kind of drama was unfolding in the halls of power, where the revolution's most committed leaders were beginning to turn their purifying gaze upon each other. At the center of this drama stood Maximilien Robespierre, a man whose name had become synonymous with revolutionary virtue, and whose fall would demonstrate the inexorable logic of a revolution that could never find enough enemies to satisfy its hunger for purity. Imagine yourself in the modest apartment on the Rue Saint-Honor where Robespierre lived with the Duplay family, a carpenter's household that had become the unlikely center of revolutionary power. The rooms are simple, almost austere, furnished with the plain wooden furniture that befits a man who has made simplicity a political principle. Robespierre's personal quarters are particularly Spartan. A narrow bed, a writing desk scarred with ink stains, shelves lined with the works of Rousseau, and classical texts on Republican virtue. There are no luxuries here, no hints of the corruption that Robespierre sees everywhere around him. The man himself is smaller than his reputation suggests, pale from long hours spent indoors, his clothing meticulously clean but deliberately modest. His powdered hair is always perfectly arranged, his linen always spotless, not from vanity, but from a conviction that moral purity must be reflected in physical appearance. He speaks in measured tones, rarely raising his voice, but his words carry the weight of absolute conviction. This is a man who has never doubted that he understands exactly what the revolution requires, exactly what France needs, exactly how to distinguish between true republicans and hidden enemies of the people. The spring of 1794, Robespierre has become the most powerful man in France without holding any official executive position. His authority flows not from constitutional mandate, but from his reputation for incorruptible virtue, his ability to identify enemies of the revolution, and his skill at articulating the moral principles that justify the terror's increasingly broad scope. He is the voice of revolutionary conscience, The man who can explain why each new category of victims represents a necessary sacrifice to the cause of freedom. But power of this kind, based entirely on moral authority and the ability to define virtue, creates its own peculiar vulnerabilities. Robespierre must constantly prove that his commitment to revolutionary principles exceeds that of his colleagues. He cannot afford to be seen as moderate, as compromising, as insufficiently vigilant against the Republic's enemies. This dynamic pushes him toward ever more extreme positions, ever broader definitions of what constitutes counter-revolutionary activity, ever more sweeping purges of those whose loyalty might be questionable. The morning routine in the Duplay household begins before dawn, when Robespierre rises to spend several hours writing speeches, reviewing reports from the Committee of Public Safety, and corresponding with revolutionary leaders throughout France. His handwriting is neat, precise, almost obsessively legible, the penmanship of a man who believes that even the formation of letters on a page reflects moral character. He writes slowly, carefully, crossing out words that might be misinterpreted, adding phrases that strengthen his arguments, crafting language that will demonstrate his unwavering commitment to revolutionary principles. His correspondence reveals the vast network of surveillance and control that has grown up around the revolution's quest for purity. Letters arrive daily from provincial committees reporting suspicious activities, requesting guidance on local political situations, seeking approval for arrests and executions. Robespierre reads each letter carefully, making notes in the margins, sometimes drafting detailed responses that explain the revolutionary principles at stake in seemingly minor local disputes. The breakfast table at the Duplay house is a place where revolutionary theory meets practical politics. The carpenter Maurice Duplay, his wife Francoise, and their daughters discuss the day's planned activities with a deference due to their famous border, but also with the familiarity of people who have lived in close quarters for months. They speak of neighborhood surveillance, of citizens who have been reported for suspicious behavior, of the need to maintain vigilance against the counter-revolutionary plots that Robespierre sees everywhere. Young Eleonore Duplay, who has developed what can only be described as romantic feelings for the revolutionary leader, listens to his morning reflections with rapt attention. She has become his unofficial secretary, copying his speeches, organizing his papers, and serving as a kind of domestic guardian of his virtue. Her devotion is touching and slightly troubling. She seems to have transformed her personal affection into a form of political worship, seeing in Robespierre not just a man, but the embodiment of revolutionary ideals. The walk from the Rue Saint-Honore to the Tuileries, where the convention meets, provides Robespierre with an opportunity to observe the mood of the city and to be seen by citizens, who regard him with a mixture of reverence and fear. He moves through the streets with a small entourage of supporters and guards, acknowledging the greetings of citizens but maintaining the dignified reserve that befits his position as the Republic's moral guardian. The streets themselves tell the story of the revolution's evolution. Buildings that once housed aristocratic families now serve as offices for revolutionary committees. Churches have been converted to secular purposes, some as meeting halls for political clubs, others as warehouses for grain and supplies. The statues and decorative elements that once proclaimed royal power have been replaced by revolutionary symbols, liberty trees, busts of martyred heroes, inscriptions celebrating the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people. But there are also signs of the strain that months of political purification have placed on the city. Many shops remain closed, their owners having fled or been arrested. The population seems smaller, more nervous, more watchful than it was even a year ago. The enthusiasm that characterized the early days of the revolution has been replaced by a kind of grim determination, a sense that the work of creating a virtuous republic requires sacrifices that grow more severe with each passing month. Convention Hall buzzes with nervous energy as representatives arrive for another day of revolutionary business. The seats that once held moderate delegates now stand empty, their former occupants having fled the country, been arrested as traitors, or simply retreated to their provinces to avoid the dangerous prominence that comes with active participation. In national politics, the delegates who remain eye each other warily, each aware that yesterday's ally might become tomorrow's enemy of the people. Robespierre takes his customary seat and surveys the assembly with the careful attention of a man who must constantly assess the loyalty and reliability of his colleagues. He has developed an almost supernatural ability to detect signs of wavering commitment, hints of secret opposition, evidence of the kind of moral corruption that he believes inevitably leads to political betrayal. His pale eyes move methodically across the hall, cataloging expressions, noting absences, interpreting gestures, and whispered conversations. The morning's agenda includes reports from the various committees that now govern France: public safety, general security, public instruction, and others. Each report is a lesson in the complexity of governing a nation in the midst of revolutionary transformation. Foreign armies threaten the borders. Internal enemies plot counter-revolution. Economic problems demand immediate attention. And the constant work of identifying and eliminating traitors continues to consume enormous amounts of time and energy. But it's during the discussion of these practical matters that the first hints of tension between Robespierre and his colleagues become apparent. Georges Danton, once his close ally in the work of revolution, has begun to suggest that perhaps the terror has accomplished its purpose, that the Republic's enemies have been sufficiently cowed, that it might be time to consider moderating the pace of executions and allowing some stability to return to French political life. Danton's physical presence provides a stark contrast to Robespierre's austere intensity. Where Robespierre is pale and precise, Danton is robust and expansive. Where Robespierre speaks in carefully crafted phrases, Danton relies on passionate oratory and emotional appeal. Where Robespierre sees the need for constant vigilance against corruption, Danton suggests that human nature includes both virtue and vice, and that a successful republic must find ways to channel rather than eliminate the latter. The philosophical differences between these two men reflect a fundamental tension within the revolution itself. Robespierre believes that creating a virtuous republic requires the elimination of vice. That compromise with human weakness inevitably leads to corruption and counter-revolution. Danton argues that politics is the art of the possible, that revolutionary ideals must be tempered by practical considerations, that a revolution that consumes its own supporters will ultimately destroy itself. Their exchanges during convention debates reveal the growing gulf between these two approaches to revolutionary governance. Robespierre speaks of the need for continued vigilance, of the danger posed by enemies who have learned to disguise their counter-revolutionary activities, of the moral imperative to prefer virtue over mercy when the Republic's survival is at stake. Danton responds with appeals for moderation, warnings about the dangers of excessive zealotry, suggestions that the revolution's enemies have been sufficiently defeated to allow for some relaxation of revolutionary discipline. But these debates are not simply abstract discussions of political philosophy. They take place against the background of very specific practical decisions about who will live and who will die, about which forms of behavior constitute evidence of counter-revolutionary activity, about how broadly or narrowly to define the categories of people who pose threats to the Republic. Every philosophical position has immediate, concrete implications for the lives of French citizens. The afternoon sessions of the convention often focus on specific cases that illustrate these larger philosophical tensions. There might be a debate about whether former merchants who have adapted to revolutionary economic policies should be trusted or viewed with suspicion. There might be discussion about the treatment of priests who have taken the constitutional oath but continue to maintain private religious beliefs. There might be arguments about the proper response to citizens who express support for revolutionary goals but seem insufficiently enthusiastic in their denunciations of the Republic's enemies. Robespierre approaches each of these cases with the methodical precision of a man who believes that moral principles, properly applied, provide clear guidance for every decision. He listens carefully to the evidence, analyzes the political implications, and renders judgments based on his understanding of what revolutionary virtue requires. His reasoning is always logical, always consistent with his stated principles, always designed to err on the side of protecting the Republic rather than protecting individuals whose loyalty might be questionable. But his colleagues have begun to notice something troubling about this approach. Robespierre's definition of revolutionary virtue seems to be growing more demanding, more exclusive, more difficult to satisfy. Behaviors that were once considered acceptable evidence of Republican loyalty are now scrutinized for hidden counter-revolutionary meanings. Citizens who were once praised as exemplary Republicans are now viewed with suspicion because their virtue seems too perfect, too performed, too obviously calculated to deflect attention from secret treasonous thoughts. The evening meetings of the Jacobin Club provide another venue for observing the evolution of Robespierre's thinking and the growing concerns of his associates. The club meets in what was once a monastery, its austere stone walls and simple wooden benches creating an atmosphere that reinforces the sense of revolutionary dedication and sacrifice. Members arrive after their day's work in the convention, or the various committees, tired but committed to the additional labor of revolutionary vigilance. Robespierre often speaks at these evening sessions, using them as opportunities to refine his thinking, to test new arguments, to gauge their response. Of committed revolutionaries to his latest insights about the threats facing the Republic. His speeches at the Jacobin Club tend to be more philosophical than his convention addresses, more concerned with grand principles than immediate practical decisions. It's during one of these evening speeches that Robespierre introduces a concept that will prove central to his ultimate downfall, the idea that the greatest threat to the revolution now comes not from obvious enemies like aristocrats and foreign agents, but from false revolutionaries who have infiltrated the Republican movement for corrupt purposes. These hidden enemies are more dangerous than open counter-revolutionaries because they work from within, corrupting the revolution's moral purity and turning its own mechanisms against its true supporters. The logic of this argument is impeccable, but its implications are terrifying. If the revolution's greatest enemies are those who appear to be its strongest supporters, then appearances can no longer be trusted. If counter-revolutionaries have learned to disguise themselves as Republicans, then Republican virtue itself becomes suspect. If the corruption of revolutionary ideals is the primary threat facing the Republic, then anyone who questions the need for continued purification might themselves be agents of corruption. The members of the Jacobin Club listen to these arguments with the respectful attention due to their most prestigious member, but some exchange glances that suggest growing unease. They have followed Robespierre this far in his logic of revolutionary purity, but they are beginning to wonder where this logic leads. If every expression of revolutionary virtue might be performance, if every call for moderation might be evidence of treachery, if every doubt about the terror's effectiveness might be proof of counter-revolutionary sympathies, then who can be trusted? Who is safe? Who can be certain that their own commitment to the revolution will be judged sufficient by the increasingly demanding standards of revolutionary orthodoxy? After the club meetings, small groups of members gather in cafes and private homes to continue their discussions. These conversations are necessarily careful, but they reveal growing anxiety about the direction of revolutionary politics. Some members express concern that the terror has begun to consume its own supporters, that the revolution's commitment to virtue has become so absolute that it tolerates no human weakness, no reasonable disagreement, no natural variation in temperament or opinion. Others argue that these concerns themselves represent a kind of counter-revolutionary thinking, that questioning the revolution's methods inevitably leads to questioning its goals, that any relaxation of revolutionary vigilance will provide opportunities for the Republic's enemies to regroup and strike back. They point to evidence of continued counter-revolutionary activity, to the ongoing war with foreign powers, to the constant discovery of new plots against the Republic as proof that Robespierre's vigilance is not excessive, but barely adequate, to the threats facing France. These debates among committed revolutionaries reveal the fundamental paradox of the Terror. It was created to protect the revolution from its enemies, but it has become so powerful, so all-encompassing, so capable of discovering threats everywhere, that it now threatens to destroy the revolution's supporters as well. The mechanism designed to preserve revolutionary virtue has become a force that questions the possibility of virtue itself, that sees corruption in every human motivation, that treats doubt and disagreement as evidence of treachery. Robespierre himself seems unaware of this paradox, or perhaps he understands it, but believes that it represents a necessary stage in the revolution's development. In his private conversations with the Duplay family, in his personal correspondence, in his late-night reflections on the challenges facing the Republic, he continues to speak with the confidence of a man who believes that he has found the key to creating a virtuous society. The solution to corruption is purification. The response to doubt is greater certainty. The answer to treachery is more comprehensive surveillance and more ruthless elimination of suspect elements. But this confidence is beginning to isolate him from his former allies and supporters, men who once shared his vision of revolutionary transformation are starting to question whether his methods can achieve the goals they all claim to share. They wonder whether a revolution that must constantly consume its own supporters can ever create the stable, virtuous republic that was the original goal of their struggle against the old regime. The isolation is subtle, at first slightly cooler. Greetings in the convention halls, more careful language in private conversations, fewer invitations to informal gatherings where political strategy is discussed. Robespierre notices these changes, but interprets them as evidence of the moral corruption he has been warning about, proof that his vigilance against false revolutionaries has been justified, confirmation that his suspicions about the loyalty of his colleagues have been accurate. This interpretation creates a vicious cycle that will ultimately prove fatal to Robespierre himself. The more isolated he becomes, the more suspicious he grows of those around him. The more suspicious he becomes, the more he speaks about the need to purify the revolution of its false supporters. The more he speaks about hidden enemies within the revolutionary movement, the more his colleagues wonder whether they might be included in his expanding definition of the Republic's enemies. And so, as the spring of 1794 progresses toward what will prove to be a fatal summer, the stage is set for the revolution to demonstrate once again its capacity to devour its own children. The same logic that justified the execution of the king, the elimination of the Girondins, and the Terror's ever-expanding list of enemies is now beginning to focus on the man who had been its most articulate defender and most ruthless implementer. The tragedy of Robespierre's position is that he will never understand what is happening to him until it is too late. He will continue to believe in the righteousness of his cause, the necessity of his methods, and the accuracy of his judgment even, as his former allies prepare to apply those same methods to him. He will go to his death convinced that he is a martyr to revolutionary virtue, never realizing that he has become a victim of the same logic of purification that he had used to justify the deaths of so many others. The month of Germinal in the year 2, what the old calendar would have called April 1794, marked the beginning of what would prove to be Robespierre's final spring. The revolutionary calendar itself reflected the ambition to transform not just politics, but time itself. to create a new way of measuring existence that would break completely with the Christian traditions of the past. Yet even as the Republic counted days according to its new system, the ancient rhythms of human ambition, fear, and betrayal continued to shape the unfolding drama in the corridors of power. Robespierre's morning routine had become even more rigid, more ritualized, as if the increasing chaos around him could be controlled through personal discipline and unwavering adherence to principle. He rose each day at precisely 5 o'clock, spending the first hour in silent reflection and prayer not to the Christian God, whose worship had been officially suppressed, but to what he called the Supreme Being, the rational deity who would guide the Republic toward virtue and justice. This daily communion with divine reason served as both spiritual preparation and political strategy, reinforcing his conviction that he was not merely a politician, but an instrument of higher purpose. The correspondence that arrived each morning painted an increasingly complex picture of France's revolutionary transformation. Letters from provincial administrators described successes in rooting out counter-revolutionary conspiracies, but they also revealed growing exhaustion among local officials who were struggling to maintain the terror's intensity across vast rural territories. Some regions reported that they were running out of obvious enemies to execute, leading to requests for guidance about how to identify more subtle forms of counter-revolutionary activity among seemingly loyal citizens. Other letters brought more troubling news. Several provincial committees reported cases of revolutionary officials who had been discovered to be corrupt, using their positions to enrich themselves or to protect friends and relatives from revolutionary justice. These revelations reinforced Robespierre's conviction that corruption was indeed the greatest threat facing the Republic, but they also suggested that the problem was far more widespread than he had initially realized. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports from Paris itself, where citizens had begun to complain privately about the revolution's direction. Informants described conversations in which even committed Republicans expressed fatigue with the constant atmosphere of suspicion and denunciation. Some citizens, it was reported, had begun to question whether the terror was still necessary, now that the Republic's most obvious enemies had been eliminated. Others wondered aloud whether the revolution's goal of creating a virtuous society was achievable, or whether human nature itself posed insurmountable obstacles to the Republican ideal. These reports troubled Robespierre deeply, not because they suggested that his policies were unpopular, but because they confirmed his worst fears about the persistence of corruption within the revolutionary movement. Citizens who questioned the necessity of revolutionary vigilance were, in his view, citizens who had been influenced by counter-revolutionary propaganda. Republicans who expressed doubt about the possibility of human virtue were Republicans whose own virtue had been compromised by contact with the Republic's enemies. The breakfast conversations at the Duplay house had taken on an increasingly conspiratorial tone as Robespierre shared his growing concerns about the loyalty of his political associates. Eleonore Duplay listened with the intense attention of someone whose personal devotion had merged completely with political commitment, while her father Maurice nodded gravely at Robespierre's observations about the subtle signs of moral corruption. Among the convention's membership, Danton grows more dangerous each day, Robespierre observed over his simple meal of bread and weak coffee. His calls for moderation sound reasonable to those who don't understand the true nature of our struggle, but they are designed to create space for counter-revolutionary activity to resurface. His voice carried the measured certainty that had made him so effective as a revolutionary leader, but there was also a new edge of anxiety, a hint that even he was beginning to feel the strain of maintaining absolute vigilance in an environment where enemies might wear the faces of friends. The walk to the convention had become an exercise in political theater, with Robespierre's supporters arranging themselves around him in a formation that suggested both protection and popular acclaim. Citizens along the route offered the required revolutionary greetings, but their responses seemed less spontaneous than in the early days of his prominence. The enthusiasm that had once greeted his appearances had been replaced by a kind of nervous respect that suggested recognition of his power rather than genuine affection for his person. The convention hall itself reflected the revolution's evolution through the changing composition of its membership. The benches that had once held the Girondins moderate Republicans who had been purged as crypto-royalists now seated men whose revolutionary credentials were unquestionable, but whose personal loyalty to Robespierre had become increasingly uncertain. These new members watched him with the careful attention of politicians who understood that their own survival might depend on correctly interpreting his moods and accurately predicting his future actions. The morning session focused on reports from the Committee of Public Safety regarding the military situation on France's borders. The news was generally positive. French armies had achieved significant victories against the coalitions of European powers that sought to crush the revolution, but even these successes created new problems for revolutionary leadership. Military victories reduced the external threats that had justified many of the terror's most extreme measures, leading some politicians to argue that internal repression could now be safely reduced. Lazare Carnot, the military genius who had organized the Republic's remarkable battlefield successes, delivered a detailed report on recent campaigns that demonstrated both his competence and his growing confidence in challenging Robespierre's political leadership. Carnot's success in organizing France's defense had given him independent prestige that made him less dependent on Robespierre's approval, and his speeches increasingly reflected a view that military victory should lead to political moderation rather than continued revolutionary purification. Our armies have proven that the Republic can defend itself against any external enemy, Carnot declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose strategies had saved France from invasion. Perhaps it is time to consider whether our internal vigilance should be correspondingly reduced, whether the extraordinary measures that were necessary during our greatest peril might now be safely modified to allow for the normal functioning of Republican government. Robespierre responded with a speech that revealed both his rhetorical brilliance and his growing isolation from practical political reality. He acknowledged the military victories, but argued that they had been achieved precisely because the revolution had maintained its commitment to virtue and its vigilance against corruption. To reduce the terror now, he suggested, would be to abandon the very policies that had made victory possible. Moreover, external military success might actually increase internal dangers by creating a false sense of security that would allow counter-revolutionary forces to regroup and strike when revolutionary vigilance was relaxed. The enemies of the people are most dangerous when they appear to be defeated, Robespierre warned, his pale eyes scanning the assembly for signs of agreement or opposition. Victory in battle means nothing if we allow corruption to triumph in our councils, if we permit false revolutionaries to undermine the moral foundations that make victory possible. The sword that defends the Republic abroad must be matched by the sword that defends virtue at home. The speech was technically masterful, logically consistent, and delivered with the conviction that had made Robespierre the revolution's most effective orator. But the response from the convention was notably muted. Representatives applauded at the appropriate moments, but without the enthusiasm that had once greeted his addresses. Some members exchanged glances that suggested private disagreement, while others studied their papers or stared at the ceiling in ways that indicated mental withdrawal from the proceedings. During the afternoon session, the convention turned to more specific matters that revealed the growing tensions within the revolutionary leadership. A debate about grain distribution policies became an occasion for Georges Danton to deliver what amounted to a veiled challenge to Robespierre's approach to governing the Republic. Speaking with the passionate eloquence that had made him one of the revolution's most compelling figures, Danton argued that effective government required compromise flexibility, and recognition of human limitations. We cannot govern France as if every citizen were a philosopher, Danton proclaimed, his robust voice filling the hall with infectious energy. The people need bread, work, and security more than they need perfect virtue. A revolution that cannot adapt to human nature is a revolution that will ultimately fail, not because its enemies are too strong, but because its demands are too pure for mortal men to meet. The contrast between Danton's earthy pragmatism and Robespierre's austere idealism could not have been more stark. Where Robespierre saw the need for constant vigilance against corruption, Danton saw the need for forgiveness and flexibility. Where Robespierre demanded absolute commitment to revolutionary virtue, Danton accepted that human beings were mixtures of good and evil impulses that needed to be managed rather than purified. Where Robespierre feared that any compromise with vice would lead to the Republic's destruction, Danton argued that any system that could not accommodate human weakness was doomed to destroy itself. The philosophical differences between these two men had personal as well as political dimensions. Robespierre lived like a monk, denying himself every pleasure that might suggest moral compromise, surrounding himself with people who reinforced his sense of virtue and mission. Danton lived like a man, enjoying good food and wine when available, maintaining friendships based on personal affection rather than political utility, allowing himself moments of doubt and uncertainty that Robespierre would have considered evidence of moral weakness. But the personal differences reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of the revolution itself. Robespierre believed that the revolution's purpose was to transform human nature, to create a new kind of citizen who would be motivated by virtue rather than self-interest. Danton believed that the revolution's purpose was to create better institutions that could channel existing human nature toward beneficial ends. Robespierre sought perfection. Danton sought improvement. Robespierre demanded transformation. Danton accepted accommodation that the evening meetings of the Committee of Public Safety had become tense affairs where these philosophical differences translated into practical disagreements about specific policies and personnel decisions. The committee met in a small, poorly ventilated room in the Tuileries complex, around a table scarred by months of intense discussion and heated argument. The walls were lined with maps showing the military situation, lists of suspected counter-revolutionaries, and reports from provincial administrators who sought guidance about implementing revolutionary policies in their regions. Robespierre arrived at these meetings with carefully prepared notes outlining his positions on each item of business, while other members seemed increasingly inclined to improvise their responses based on immediate practical considerations. The contrast in styles reflected the growing gulf between Robespierre's systematic approach to revolutionary governance and his colleagues' more flexible attitudes toward political compromise. The specific issue that brought these tensions to a head was the question of what to do about Danton himself. Reports had begun to circulate suggesting that Danton had used his political influence to protect friends and associates from revolutionary justice, that he had accepted gifts from grateful citizens whose lives he had saved, and that he had expressed private doubts about the wisdom of continuing the terror at its current intensity. None of these charges, taken individually, constituted clear evidence of counter-revolutionary activity, but collectively they painted a picture of someone whose commitment to revolutionary virtue might be insufficient for the challenges facing the Republic. Robespierre had spent weeks analyzing these reports, searching for patterns that might reveal the true nature of Danton's political evolution. He had consulted with trusted associates, reviewed correspondence that had been intercepted by revolutionary surveillance, and reflected on the political implications of taking action against someone who remained popular with many convention members and with significant portions of the Parisian population. The decision, when it finally came, reflected both Robespierre's logical consistency and his fatal blindness to political reality. If corruption was indeed the greatest threat facing the Republic, If counter-revolutionary activity could be disguised as moderate republicanism, if the revolution's survival required absolute commitment to virtue regardless of personal cost, then Dantong's growing criticism of the terror marked him as a threat that could not be tolerated. The process of building a case against Danton required months of careful preparation and political maneuvering. Evidence had to be gathered, all eyes had to be consulted, and public opinion had to be prepared for the shocking spectacle of the revolution, consuming one of its most prominent leaders. Robespierre approached this task with the same methodical precision he brought to all his political work, treating it as a necessary but regrettable duty rather than a personal vendetta. The actual arrest, when it came in the early hours of Germinal 30, March 30th, 1794, in the old calendar, followed a now familiar pattern of revolutionary justice. Guards appeared at Dantong's residence before dawn, presenting warrants signed by the Committee of Public Safety that authorized his detention on charges of conspiracy against the liberty of the nation and the security of the Republic. Dantong's wife Antoinette collapsed when the charges were read, while Danton himself seemed more surprised than frightened by the turn of events. "So this is how the revolution treats its defenders," Danton reportedly said as he was led away. "Today it's me, tomorrow it will be you," he called to the guards, in words that would prove more prophetic than anyone present could have imagined. His arrest marked the beginning of a trial that would demonstrate both the terror's efficiency and its ultimate, self-destructive logic. The public reaction to Dantong's arrest was notably muted, suggesting that the Parisian population had become either apathetic about political purges or too frightened to express opinions about the fate of prominent leaders. The newspapers, now completely controlled by revolutionary authorities, explained the arrest in language that had become standardized for such occasions. Danton had been revealed as a false revolutionary, whose moderate positions masked counter-revolutionary sympathies, whose criticism of the terror represented an attempt to create opportunities for the Republic's enemies to regroup and strike back. But privately, among the political class that governed revolutionary France, Dantong's arrest created a new level of anxiety about the future direction of the revolution. If someone with Dantong's revolutionary credentials could be designated as an enemy of the people, if his popularity and past services could not protect him from the logic of revolutionary purification, then no one was safe. The terror had demonstrated once again its capacity to expand its definition of suspicious behavior, to discover new categories of treachery, to find enemies in the most unexpected places. Robespierre himself seemed energized rather than troubled by the decision to move against Danton. In his speeches to the Convention and the Jacobin Club, he spoke with renewed confidence about the revolution's progress toward creating a virtuous republic. The elimination of false revolutionaries like Danton, he argued, would allow true republicans to focus on the positive work of constructing new institutions and educating citizens in the principles of virtue that would make counter-revolution impossible. The Republic's greatest victories are not won on foreign battlefields, he declared in a speech that demonstrated both his rhetorical power and his dangerous detachment from political reality. They are won in the hearts and minds of citizens, who learn to prefer virtue to vice, duty to pleasure, the common good to private interest. Every enemy we eliminate brings us closer to the day when such eliminations will no longer be necessary, because virtue will have triumphed so completely that vice will no longer dare to show its face. The trial of Danton and his associates was conducted with the efficient procedures that had been developed for processing the revolution's enemies. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and the accused were given opportunities to defend themselves within the constraints of revolutionary justice. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Revolutionary Tribunal had become a mechanism for confirming decisions that had already been made by the political leadership rather than an independent forum for determining guilt or innocence. Dantong's defense was passionate and personally moving, but it was also politically irrelevant. He spoke of his services to the revolution, his role in defending the Republic against its enemies, his commitment to the cause of freedom and equality. He argued that his calls for moderation represented not counter-revolutionary sentiment, but practical wisdom about the challenges of governing a large and diverse nation. He appealed to the memories of those who had worked with him in the early days of the revolution, when the enemy was clearly external, and the need for unity among Republicans was universally recognized. But these arguments, however persuasive they might have been in normal political circumstances, carried no weight in the context of revolutionary justice. The tribunal's task was not to weigh Dantong's contributions against his errors, but to determine whether his recent behavior constituted evidence of counter-revolutionary activity. Given the revolution's expanding definition of what constituted such activity, and given the political pressure to confirm the wisdom of the Committee of Public Safety's decision to arrest him, the verdict was predetermined. The execution of Danton and his associates on Floreal 16, April 5, 1794, was attended by smaller crowds than had gathered for previous political executions, suggesting that the Parisian population was growing weary of the spectacle of revolutionary justice. Those who did attend seemed more subdued than enthusiastic, responding to the deaths with a kind of mechanical approval that had replaced genuine political passion in much of the revolutionary audience. Dantong's final words from the scaffold were characteristically dramatic and prophetic. "Show my head to the people," he reportedly told the executioner. It is worth seeing. But perhaps more significant were his earlier comments during the trial, when he warned that the revolution's logic of purification would ultimately consume those who believed themselves safe from its reach. "You will follow me within 3 months," he predicted, addressing his accusers with the bitter accuracy of someone who understood the dynamics of revolutionary politics better than those who condemned him. For Robespierre, Dantong's execution marked both a personal triumph and the beginning of his own ultimate downfall. He had demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for political principle, his commitment to revolutionary virtue, regardless of popular opinion, his determination to see the terror through to its logical conclusion. But he had also eliminated one of the few remaining political figures who possessed the stature and the courage to challenge his decisions openly. The removal of Danton created a political vacuum that could prove impossible to fill. Other potential critics of Robespierre's policies either lacked Dantong's popular appeal or were too frightened by his fate to risk similar confrontation. The convention became increasingly passive, more willing to approve Robespierre's proposals without serious debate, more focused on avoiding attention than on exercising genuine political leadership. This apparent triumph of Robespierre's authority was actually a sign of its fatal weakness. Political power that depends entirely on fear is inherently unstable because it creates incentives for those who possess it to use it preemptively against potential threats. As Robespierre's influence over the convention grew more complete, his paranoia about hidden enemies grew more intense. The very success of his methods convinced him that they needed to be applied even more broadly against even more subtle forms of opposition. The spring of 1794 thus marked a turning point in the revolution's internal dynamics. The terror had successfully eliminated the most obvious threats to Republican government aristocrats, refractory priests, foreign agents, and regional rebels. But instead of leading to a reduction in revolutionary vigilance, these successes had created pressure to identify new, more sophisticated threats that required even greater surveillance and more comprehensive purification. The logic that had justified the execution of Danton would prove to be the same logic that would ultimately justify action against Robespierre himself. If criticism of the terror was evidence of counter-revolutionary sympathy, if moderation was a mask for treachery, If popularity with the people could be a tool of demagogues seeking to undermine Republican virtue, then any political figure who accumulated too much independent power or who questioned the wisdom of continued purification could be designated as an enemy of the Republic. Robespierre seemed unaware of this dynamic, or perhaps he believed that his own virtue was so transparent, his own commitment to revolutionary principles so absolute, that he could never be subject to the suspicions he directed against others. This confidence would prove to be his most dangerous illusion, a fatal blind spot that would prevent him from recognizing the signs of his own approaching downfall until it was too late to prevent it. The months following Danton's execution unfolded with the inexorable logic of a classical tragedy, where each action taken to prevent disaster only hastens its arrival. Robespierre, having eliminated his most prominent critic, found himself in the paradoxical position of being simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable than ever before. The very completeness of his authority created the conditions for his ultimate downfall, as colleagues who had once been merely cautious began to fear for their own lives. The summer of 1794, Messidor and Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar brought an intensification of the terror that seemed to reflect Robespierre's growing isolation and mounting paranoia. The daily lists of condemned prisoners grew longer, the categories of suspicious behavior expanded further, and the pace of executions increased to levels that began to exhaust even the most committed supporters of revolutionary justice. Paris had become a city where the scaffold worked overtime, where the sound of the guillotine had become as regular as church bells had once been in the Duplay household. The atmosphere had grown increasingly claustrophobic as Robespierre's concerns about hidden enemies began to affect his daily routine. He spoke less at meals, spending more time locked in his room, writing speeches and analyzing reports that seemed to confirm his worst suspicions about the extent of counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Eleonore Duplay watched him with growing concern, noting how his already pale complexion had become almost ghostly, how his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was observing, how his eyes had developed a haunted quality that suggested sleepless nights filled with anxious reflection. The correspondence that arrived each morning brought reports from across France that painted a picture of a nation simultaneously triumphant and exhausted. Military victories continued to accumulate as French armies pushed back the foreign coalitions that had sought to crush the revolution. The Republic's borders were more secure than they had been since the war began, and internal rebellions had been largely suppressed through a combination of military action and revolutionary terror. By any objective measure, the threats that had originally justified the terror's extraordinary measures had been significantly reduced. Robespierre interpreted this apparent success as evidence that his vigilance had been justified, and that even greater vigilance would be required to preserve the victories that had been achieved. In his view, external enemies would respond to military defeat by intensifying their efforts to corrupt the revolution from within. Foreign gold would flow to French traders, counter-revolutionary propaganda would become more sophisticated, and false revolutionaries would work even harder to disguise their true loyalties. Victory makes us more dangerous to our enemies, not less, he explained to the Duplay family over breakfast, his voice carrying the measured conviction that had become his trademark. They know now that they cannot defeat us through open warfare, so they will concentrate all their resources on destroying us through corruption and deception. We must be even more careful about who we trust, even more vigilant about signs of moral compromise among those who claim to support the Republic. This analysis led Robespierre to propose what would prove to be his most politically dangerous initiative, a comprehensive purge of the convention itself, designed to eliminate the Una. False revolutionaries, he was convinced, had infiltrated the national legislature. In a series of speeches delivered throughout the early summer, he began to speak openly about the need to cleanse the representative body of elements whose loyalty to Republican virtue was questionable. The reaction to these proposals among convention members was one of barely concealed terror. Representatives who had watched the elimination of the Girondins, the execution of Danton, and the steady expansion of the terror's reach understood that they might now be targets themselves. The criteria for determining who qualified as a false revolutionary were so broad and so subjective that virtually any member could potentially be designated as an enemy of the people. Joseph Fauch, who had served as Robespierre's agent in suppressing counter-revolution in Lyon, began to emerge as a focal point for opposition to further purges. Fauch's brutal efficiency in eliminating the Republic's enemies had initially earned Robespierre's approval, but his growing independence and his tendency to question the wisdom of continued escalation had made him suspect in the eyes of the revolutionary leadership. Moreover, Fauch possessed the kind of detailed knowledge about revolutionary procedures and personnel that could make him either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy. The tension between Robespierre and Fauch reflected a broader pattern that was developing within the revolutionary government. Officials who had risen to prominence through their zealous implementation of the terror were beginning to understand that their very success made them potential targets for the next round of purification. They had eliminated the revolution's obvious enemies so thoroughly that new enemies would have to be found among the revolutionaries themselves. Fauch began to organize what could only be described as a conspiracy of the terrified, a network of convention members and government officials who understood that their survival might depend on acting against Robespierre before he could act against them. This conspiracy was not motivated by opposition to the revolution's goals or sympathy for its enemies, but by the simple desire for self-preservation in the face of a political system that had become dangerously unpredictable. The meetings where this opposition took shape were necessarily secret and carefully organized to avoid the surveillance networks that Robespierre had established throughout Paris. Small groups of representatives met in private homes, in obscure cafes, in the offices of government departments where their presence could be explained by official business. The conversations were conducted in the coded language that had become necessary for any political discussion that strayed from absolute orthodoxy. Our friend from Arras has become perhaps too dedicated to the cause of virtue, one member might observe, referring to Robespierre by his birthplace rather than his name. His commitment to purification may be leading him to see corruption where none exists, to discover enemies where there are only differences of opinion about methods and timing. Such carefully phrased criticisms allowed participants to express their concerns, while maintaining plausible deniability if their words were reported to the authorities. The psychological atmosphere in these meetings was extraordinary, a mixture of revolutionary fervor and personal terror that reflected the impossible position in which the terror's supporters found themselves. These were men who genuinely believed in the revolution's goals, who had risked their lives and sacrificed their comfort for the cause of Republican virtue. But they had also witnessed how quickly revolutionary virtue could be redefined to exclude those who had once been considered exemplary citizens. The response to the speech was immediate and dramatic. Rather than the awed silence that had once greeted Robespierre's major addresses, the convention erupted in barely controlled chaos as representatives demanded to know whether they were among those targeted for elimination. The questions came from all sides. What specific evidence supported these accusations? Which officials were suspected of corruption? What procedures would be followed to determine guilt or innocence? Robespierre's attempts to answer these questions only made the situation worse. His responses were evasive, philosophical, focused on general principles rather than specific procedures. He seemed genuinely surprised by the negative reaction to his speech, apparently believing that his reputation for virtue would be sufficient to ensure acceptance of his recommendations without detailed explanations or specific evidence. The debate That followed revealed the complete breakdown of trust between Robespierre and his former allies. Jean Lambert Tallien, who had implemented the terror in Bordeaux with ruthless efficiency, stood to challenge Robespierre's right to act as judge of other revolutionaries' virtue. "Who made you the sole arbiter of Republican loyalty?" Tallien demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "What gives you the authority to condemn men who have risked everything for the cause of freedom?" The personal attacks that followed were devastating in their effectiveness. Speaker after speaker rose to challenge not just Robespierre's specific proposals, but his fitness to continue in leadership. They accused him of establishing a personal dictatorship under the guise of defending virtue, of using the terror to eliminate political rivals rather than genuine enemies of the Republic, of losing touch with the practical requirements of governing a large and complex nation. Fouch delivered what amounted to a political death sentence when he accused Robespierre of planning to eliminate the convention itself and establish a personal tyranny based on his claimed monopoly of revolutionary virtue. "He speaks of purification," Fouch declared, "but what he seeks is the elimination of anyone who might question his judgment or challenge his authority. This is not virtue. It is ambition disguised as virtue." The session that began with Robespierre's confident presentation of his analysis ended with his complete political isolation. Representatives, who had once competed to demonstrate their loyalty to his leadership, now competed to distance themselves from his policies and person. The tide of revolutionary politics had turned with stunning suddenness, and the man who had seemed invulnerable just hours earlier now found himself fighting for his political life. That evening, as Robespierre returned to the Duplay house, he encountered a level of hostility from his colleagues that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. The streets that had once provided occasions for demonstrations of popular support now seemed filled with citizens whose expressions ranged from indifference to open hostility. The revolutionary symbols that had once seemed to celebrate his authority now appeared to mock his pretensions to embodying the revolution spirit. The Duplay family received him with the same devotion they had always shown, but even they seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in his political position. Eleanor's attempts to comfort him were touching but ineffective, while Maurice Duplay's expressions of confidence in his ultimate vindication carried a hollow ring that suggested even his most loyal supporters were beginning to doubt his ability to survive the crisis he had precipitated. The night of Thermidor 8-9 was spent in frantic activity as both sides prepared for the final confrontation that now seemed inevitable. Robespierre's supporters, led by his brother Augustin and his close associate Georges Couthon, attempted to organize a defense based on appeals to the Paris Commune and the radical sections that had traditionally supported his policies, argued that the convention's revolt represented a counter-revolutionary conspiracy designed to destroy the terror and restore the Republic's enemies to power. Meanwhile, Fouch and his allies worked through the night to ensure that they had sufficient support to complete Robespierre's political destruction when the convention reconvened. They distributed lists of representatives who could be counted on to vote for his arrest, identified potential waverers who might be persuaded to join the anti-Robespierre coalition, and prepared the legal and political arguments that would justify their action against the man who had been the terror's most articulate defender. The session of Thermidor 9, July 27, 1794, began with an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that suggested all participants understood they were witnessing a historic moment. Robespierre attempted to address the convention, to explain his position and defend his proposals, but he was repeatedly interrupted by hostile representatives who demanded immediate action rather than additional speeches. The formal motion for his arrest was presented by Jean-Baptiste Billaud Varennes, one of his former allies on the Committee of Public Safety. The charges were necessarily vague conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, attempts to establish personal dictatorship, corruption of revolutionary virtue for personal ends, but they were sufficient for the purpose at hand. The convention's vote was overwhelming. Robespierre, his brother Augustin, and several close associates were ordered arrested and removed from the Femme. Legislative chamber got the dramatic irony of the moment was lost on no one present. The same procedures that had been used to eliminate the revolution's enemies, the same appeals to revolutionary virtue that had justified the terror's expansion, the same language about protecting the Republic from corruption, all of these were now being applied to the man who had been their most effective advocate. The revolution had indeed begun to devour its own children, and the process would now claim its most prominent victim. The final act of the drama played out in the streets of Paris, where Robespierre's supporters made a desperate attempt to rally popular support for his cause. The Paris Commune declared its loyalty to the arrested leaders and called for an insurrection against the convention's counter-revolutionary actions. But the response from the sections and the sans-culottes was notably lukewarm, suggesting that Robespierre's political isolation extended beyond the convention to the broader population that had once supported his policies. The military units that might have defended Robespierre remained loyal to the convention, their commanders understanding that the tide of political opinion had turned decisively against the former revolutionary leader. By the evening of Thermidor 9, it was clear that the attempted resistance had failed and that Robespierre's fate was sealed. The execution of Robespierre and his associates on Thermidor 10, July 28, 1794, drew enormous crowds to the Place de la Révolution, but the atmosphere was strikingly different from previous political executions. There was less celebration than relief, less enthusiasm than exhaustion. The crowds that gathered seemed to understand that they were witnessing not just the death of a political leader, but the end of an era in the revolution's development. Robespierre himself faced death with the same dignity he had maintained throughout his political career, refusing to provide his enemies with the satisfaction of seeing him beg for mercy or recant his principles. His final hours were spent in reflection on the cause to which he had devoted his life, apparently still convinced that his actions had been justified by the necessity of defending revolutionary virtue against its enemies, that the irony of his death was perfect and terrible. He died convinced that he was a martyr to the cause of virtue, never understanding that he had become a victim of the same logic of revolutionary purity that he had used to justify the deaths of so many others. The revolution had indeed eaten its own children, and in doing so, it had demonstrated the ultimate impossibility of achieving political perfection through the elimination of human imperfection. With Robespierre's death, the terror effectively ended, not because the revolution's enemies had been defeated, but because the revolutionaries themselves had grown exhausted by the constant anxiety and mutual suspicion that the pursuit of perfect virtue had created. The Thermidorian reaction that followed would bring a different set of challenges and contradictions, but it would also bring relief from the impossible burden of trying to create a society where virtue was enforced through fear and human nature was transformed through violence. As the terror's machinery ground to a halt in the aftermath of Robespierre's fall, the people of Paris began to reflect on the symbols that had launched their revolution. None was more powerful, more mythologized, or more misunderstood than the Bastille, the medieval fortress whose destruction on July 14, 1789, had become the revolution's founding moment. But what had actually been inside those massive stone walls? When the crowd stormed them, what secrets had they expected to find, and what reality had they actually discovered? Imagine yourself standing before the Bastille on the morning of July 13, 1789, the day before its destruction. The fortress rises before you like something from another age, its 8 massive towers connected by walls 40 feet thick at their base. The medieval stonework is dark with centuries of Parisian soot and weather, giving the structure an ominous presence that seems to embody all the oppressive weight of royal authority. Peasants and bourgeois citizens gather in small groups around the fortress, speaking in hushed tones about the rumors that have circulated for generations. The torture chambers, the secret prisoners, the instruments of royal tyranny hidden within those impenetrable walls. The Bastille had been built in the 14th century as part of Paris's defensive fortifications, but by 1789 it had evolved into something far more symbolically powerful than militarily useful. Its 8 towers, the Tour du Coin, Tour de la Chapelle, Tour du Trésor, Tour de la Comte, Tour de la Bataillère, Tour de la Bassinière, Tour de la Liberté, and Tour du Puits, had become synonymous in the popular imagination with the arbitrary exercise of royal power. This was where the king's enemies disappeared, where dissidents vanished without trial, where the letters de cachet, those dreaded sealed orders that could imprison anyone without explanation, sent their victims. But the reality of the Bastille, in its final years, was far more prosaic than its fearsome reputation suggested. The fortress that had once housed important political prisoners had gradually been transformed into something resembling a genteel boarding house for aristocrats and intellectuals who had offended the crown in relatively minor ways. The days of genuine torture and systematic brutality had long passed, replaced by a regime that was more concerned with comfortable detention than harsh punishment. The morning routine within the Bastille on July 13, 1789, began much as it had for years. The 7 prisoners then held in the fortress awakened in rooms that, while certainly confined, bore little resemblance to the dungeons of popular imagination. Each prisoner occupied a chamber in one of the towers, furnished with a bed, table, chairs, and writing materials. They were allowed books from an extensive library, could receive visitors under certain circumstances, and were served meals prepared by the fortress's kitchen staff. The Comte de Solange, imprisoned for debt and involvement in a grain speculation. Scandal spent his morning reading Voltaire's philosophical works and composing letters to his family. His room in the Tour de la Liberté was adequately heated, well lit by large windows, and decorated with personal possessions he had been allowed to bring from his estate. His primary complaint was not about physical hardship, but about the indefinite nature of his detention. He had been imprisoned for 2 years without trial, held under a letter de cachet that gave no indication of when he might be released, docked in the Tour du Trésor. Jean-Antoine Tavernier, a mentally ill man whose family had arranged his imprisonment to prevent him from dissipating their fortune, maintained the elaborate delusions that had led to his confinement. He believed himself to be Julius Caesar and spent his days writing detailed military plans for conquests that existed only in his imagination. The fortress staff treated him with patient kindness, understanding that his condition made him more pitiable than dangerous. The most famous prisoner was undoubtedly the Marquis de Sade, who had been transferred to the Charenton Asylum just days before the fortress fell. His cell in the Tour de la Liberté had been his home for nearly 6 years, during which time he had written prolifically, including parts of what would later become the 120 Days of Sodom. His presence in the Bastille had been the result of his sexual scandals and the determination of his mother-in-law to keep him away from polite society rather than any overt political opposition to the crown. The fortress's governor, Bernard René Delaunay, was a career military officer who had inherited his position from his father and approached his duties with the conscientiousness of a man managing a peculiar but not particularly onerous assignment. His morning routine included reviewing the security arrangements, meeting with his staff of 30-odd guards and servants, and attending to the administrative details required for maintaining the fortress and caring for its inmates. Delaunay was acutely aware of the growing tension in Paris and the increasing hostility towards symbols of royal authority. Reports reached him daily of crowds gathering in various parts of the city, of inflammatory speeches being delivered at the Palais Royal, of rumors spreading about the king's intentions toward the newly formed National Assembly. But he had received no specific instructions about how to respond to potential unrest, leaving him to rely on his own judgment about the appropriate level of vigilance. The fortress's defenses, while formidable in appearance, were not actually designed for sustained siege warfare against a determined modern enemy. The thick medieval walls could resist cannon fire from the types of artillery commonly available in the 14th century, but they were vulnerable to the more powerful weapons of the 18th century. More importantly, the fortress's greatest weakness was its dependence on outside supplies. It lacked adequate stores of food, water, and ammunition for a prolonged siege. The armory within the Bastille contained an impressive array of weapons, but most were ceremonial pieces or antiques, maintained more for their historical value than their military utility. The fortress did house a significant quantity of gunpowder, approximately 250 barrels, which had been stored there because the Bastille's thick walls provided better security than most other locations in Paris. This gunpowder would prove to be the crowd's primary objective when they eventually stormed the fortress, though most of the attackers were probably unaware of its presence when they began their assault. The library within the Bastille was one of the finest in Paris, containing thousands of volumes on subjects ranging from philosophy and literature to military science and theology. Prisoners were encouraged to read as a form of both education and entertainment, and many had contributed their own works to the collection during their periods of confinement. The library reflected the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and learning. Even in the context of royal imprisonment, prisoners were expected to use their time constructively rather than simply endure their punishment. The fortress's chapel, located in the Tour de la Chapelle, served both the spiritual needs of the prisoners and the symbolic function of demonstrating the crown's commitment to Christian values. Mass was celebrated daily, and prisoners were expected to attend unless their physical or mental condition made participation impossible. The chapel's furnishings were simple but elegant, reflecting the same peculiar combination of constraint and comfort that characterized the rest of the fortress. The daily routine for the Bastille's inhabitants followed patterns that had evolved over centuries of institutional development. Prisoners awakened at dawn, attended morning prayers, received their first meal of the day, and then were generally free to pursue whatever activities their individual circumstances permitted. Reading, writing, and quiet conversation were encouraged. Loud disturbances or attempts to communicate with the outside world were strictly forbidden. The fortress's isolation from the surrounding city was both physical and psychological. While the Bastille stood in the heart of Paris, its high walls and restricted access created a kind of artificial separation from the urban environment. Prisoners could hear the sounds of city life, the cries of street vendors, the clatter of carriage wheels, the bells of nearby churches, but they could not participate in the daily activities that created those sounds. For many prisoners, this isolation was the most difficult aspect of their confinement. Physical deprivation was minimal, but the psychological impact of separation from family, friends, and the normal rhythms of social life created a different kind of suffering. Letters were strictly censored, visits were carefully supervised, and any attempt to maintain unauthorized contact with the outside world could result in more restrictive treatment. To truly understand what the revolutionaries discovered when they breached the Bastille's walls, we must delve deeper into the archaeological evidence and historical records that reveal the fortress's transformation over its 4 centuries of existence. The stones themselves tell a story far more complex than the simple narrative of oppression that had motivated the crowd's assault, a story of institutional evolution, changing concepts of justice, and the gradual humanization of royal punishment. Imagine yourself exploring the Bastille's interior spaces in the weeks following its capture, when curiosity seekers and investigators combed through every chamber, every corridor, every hidden corner of the fortress. The reality they uncovered was simultaneously more mundane and more fascinating than the legends that had surrounded the place. Each tower held its own secrets, but they were the secrets of daily life rather than the dramatic mysteries of popular imagination. The Tour du Coin, the fortress's northeastern tower, housed what had once been the governor's apartments and administrative offices. The rooms were spacious by 18th century standards, with high ceilings, large windows that provided natural light throughout most of the day, and furniture that spoke of comfort rather than austerity. The governor's quarters included a sitting room, bedroom, study, and dining area, all furnished with pieces that would not have been out of place in a prosperous bourgeois household. In the governor's study, investigators found extensive records dating back decades, meticulously maintained. Ledgers that documented every aspect of the fortress's operation. These records revealed the bureaucratic machinery that had governed prison life, detailed accounts of expenditures for food, clothing, and maintenance, correspondence with royal officials about the treatment of specific prisoners, inventories of the fortress's contents that listed everything from weapons to books to kitchen utensils. The financial records were particularly revealing, showing that the cost of maintaining the Bastille was enormous by the standards of the time. The crown spent approximately 600,000 livres annually to operate the fortress, roughly equivalent to the yearly income of several hundred middle-class families. This expenditure supported not only the prisoners and guards, but an entire community of craftsmen, servants, and specialists who maintained the complex infrastructure of royal detention. The Tour de la Chapelle contained not only the fortress's religious facilities, but also some of its most poignant archaeological evidence. Beneath the chapel's stone floor, investigators found burial records and physical remains that told the story of 4 centuries of imprisonment. The graves were mostly unmarked, reflecting the crown's desire to maintain secrecy about who had been held in the fortress. But the burial practices revealed a surprising attention to Christian dignity, even for those who had died in royal custody. Chapel itself bore the marks of centuries of use by prisoners seeking spiritual comfort in their confinement. The stone walls were covered with inscriptions, some carved, others written in various substances that provided intimate glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of people who had found themselves cut off from the outside world. These graffiti included prayers, declarations of innocence, expressions of love for family members, and bitter complaints about the injustice of royal authority. One particularly moving inscription, carved into the stone with painstaking care, read, Marie de Rohan, imprisoned by letter de cachet, 1742. God sees my innocence, though man condemns my love. Historical records suggest this referred to a young woman whose romantic involvement with a man her family considered unsuitable had led to her detention at the request of her relatives, a common use of the letter de cachet system that allowed families to imprison troublesome members without public scandal. The Tour du Trésor had served various functions over the centuries, including periods when it actually housed royal treasures and important state documents. By 1789, however, it was being used primarily for prisoner accommodation and contained some of the fortress's most comfortable quarters. The rooms in this tower were larger than those in other parts of the fortress, with better heating and more elaborate furnishings that reflected their use for high status. Prisoners who could afford to pay for enhanced accommodations. Archaeological investigation of the Tour du Trésor revealed evidence of the prisoners' attempts to make their quarters more homelike. Scratches in the stone walls marked where furniture had been arranged and rearranged, while small holes drilled into the masonry showed where prisoners had hung personal possessions, artwork, or makeshift curtains to provide privacy and comfort. These modifications spoke to the human need to create personal space even within the constraints of imprisonment. The tower's windows had been modified over the years to provide better views of the surrounding city while maintaining security. Iron bars prevented escape, but the openings were large enough to allow prisoners to observe the daily life of Paris spread out below them. Many prisoners wrote in their memoirs about the psychological importance of these windows, the ability to see the world outside their walls, to watch the changing seasons, to maintain some connection with the life from which they had been separated. The Tour de la Comte housed the fortress's most extensive library facilities, reflecting the Enlightenment's emphasis on education and moral improvement through learning. The collection included over 8,000 volumes, covering subjects from classical literature to contemporary philosophy, from military science to theological treatises. The books showed extensive signs of used marginal notes, underlined passages, and wear patterns that testified to generations of prisoners who had sought escape through reading. The library's catalog, preserved in the fortress's records, revealed the intellectual interests of its users. Classical authors like Plutarch and Cicero were heavily represented, suggesting that prisoners sought inspiration from accounts of virtue and civic dedication. Contemporary philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were also well represented, indicating that even within the royal prison system, Enlightenment ideas about individual rights and social justice circulated freely. But perhaps most interesting were the books written by prisoners themselves during their confinement. The Bastille had developed a tradition of encouraging literary production as a form of rehabilitation and entertainment. Prisoners were provided with writing materials and encouraged to pursue creative projects, resulting in a remarkable collection of memoirs, philosophical treatises, poetry, and fiction produced within the fortress walls. The Tour de la Bertaudiere had been modified in the mid-18th century to provide what were essentially luxury accommodations for aristocratic prisoners who could afford to pay for enhanced treatment. These rooms were furnished with carpets, curtains, comfortable chairs, and writing desks that would have been appropriate for a well-appointed private residence. Prisoners in these quarters could bring personal servants, receive regular visits from family members, and maintain correspondence with the outside world subject only to censorship rather than complete prohibition. Archaeological evidence from these luxury quarters revealed the extent to which imprisonment in the Bastille could be made comfortable for those with adequate resources. Excavations uncovered fragments of fine china, crystal glassware, and silver cutlery that had been used for private dining. Food preparation facilities allowed prisoners to supplement the fortress's standard meals with delicacies prepared according to their personal preferences. The contrast between these luxury accommodations and the simpler quarters provided for less affluent prisoners highlighted the class distinctions that persisted even within the prison system. While all prisoners were subject to the same basic restrictions on their freedom, their daily experiences of confinement varied dramatically, depending on their ability to pay for enhanced treatment. The Tour de la Bazinière contained the fortress's medical facilities, which provided healthcare that was superior to what most Parisians could expect to receive. The infirmary was equipped with beds, medical instruments, and pharmaceutical supplies that reflected current understanding of medical practice. Records show that the fortress employed qualified physicians and surgeons who were responsible for maintaining the health of both prisoners and staff. Medical records preserved in the fortress archives provide insights into the health challenges faced by long-term prisoners. While physical abuse was not routine, the psychological effects of prolonged confinement created their own medical problems. Physicians' notes describe cases of what would now be recognized as depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions resulting from isolation and uncertainty about the duration of imprisonment. The medical facilities also revealed the fortress's efforts to prevent the spread of disease, which was a constant threat in any institutional setting of the period. Sanitation systems while primitive by modern standards, were sophisticated for their time and helped to maintain relatively healthy conditions within the fortress. The thick stone walls provided natural insulation that kept interior temperatures more stable than most buildings of the era. The Tour de la Liberté, ironically named, given its function housed some of the fortress's most famous prisoners during their periods of confinement. Archaeological investigation of this tower uncovered extensive evidence of the intellectual activities that had occupied prisoners during their detention. Hidden compartments contained manuscripts, letters, and personal documents that prisoners had concealed from their jailers. One of the most significant discoveries was a cache of writings by the Marquis de Sade, who had been transferred from the Bastille just days before its destruction. These manuscripts, hidden behind a loose stone in his cell wall, included not only portions of his notorious literary works, but also more conventional writings, letters to his wife, philosophical reflections on his imprisonment, and practical observations about daily life within the fortress. Sade's hidden writings revealed the complex psychology of long-term imprisonment and the strategies prisoners developed to maintain their sanity and sense of identity. His descriptions of daily routines, relationships with guards and fellow prisoners, and reflections on the nature of freedom and confinement provided intimate insights into the human experience of royal detention. The Tour du Puits contained the fortress's water supply and storage facilities, but archaeological investigation revealed that it had also served as a repository for confiscated materials, books, letters, personal possessions, and other items that had been taken from prisoners or intercepted during their correspondence with the outside world. These confiscated materials provided a fascinating archive of 18th century French culture and politics. Among the confiscated books were works that had been banned by royal censors, including political treatises that criticized absolute monarchy, religious works that challenged Catholic orthodoxy, and literary productions that were considered morally corrupting. The presence of these materials in the fortress library suggested that prisoners had sometimes been allowed to read books that were forbidden to the general population, perhaps because confinement itself was considered adequate protection against the spread of dangerous ideas. The confiscated correspondence revealed the networks of family, friendship, and political association that connected prisoners to the outside world. Letters between spouses separated by imprisonment provided touching evidence of enduring love and loyalty, while political correspondence showed how prisoners maintained their involvement in the intellectual and social movements of their time. Despite their physical confinement, the fortress's kitchen and dining facilities, located in the courtyard and lower levels of several towers, revealed the surprisingly elaborate arrangements made for feeding prisoners and staff. The kitchen was equipped with multiple hearths, extensive storage areas, and specialized equipment for preparing meals for hundreds of people with varying dietary requirements and financial resources. Menu records preserved in the fortress archives showed that prisoners' meals were substantial and varied, particularly for those who could afford to pay for enhanced food service. Standard meals included bread, meat, vegetables, and wine, while wealthy prisoners could arrange for additional courses and special preparations. The contrast with the simple bread and water of popular imagination could not have been more striking. Morning of July 14, 1789, dawned clear and warm, carrying with it the sense of summer in Paris and the electricity of political tension that had been building for weeks. Within the Bastille's walls, the daily routine proceeded much as it had for years, but outside, the city was awakening to what would become one of the most significant days in human history. The fortress that had stood as a symbol of royal authority for 4 centuries was about to meet its end, and with it would die not just a building, but an entire conception of how political power should relate to individual liberty. Governor Delaunay began his morning with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his administration of the fortress. His correspondence from the previous evening included reports of increasing unrest in the city, warnings about crowds gathering near the invalids, and rumors that weapons were being distributed among the population. But he had received no specific instructions from Versailles about how to respond to potential threats, leaving him to rely on his own judgment about the appropriate level of defensive preparation. The 7 prisoners within the fortress were largely unaware of the drama building outside their walls. They followed their usual routines, reading, writing, conversing with guards, and participating in the various activities that had made their confinement bearable. The Comte de Solange worked on his memoirs, documenting his experiences with the grain trade that had led to his imprisonment. Tavernier continued his elaborate military fantasies, drawing detailed battle plans for campaigns that existed only in his imagination. The other prisoners pursued their own particular interests, unaware that they were about to become footnotes to history. The fortress's staff of guards, servants, and administrators numbered approximately 82 men, including the governor himself. Many were veterans of royal military service who had been assigned to the Bastille as a form of honorable retirement. They were competent and loyal, but they were not a military force capable of withstanding sustained assault by hundreds of determined attackers. Their training and experience had prepared them for maintaining security within the fortress, not for defending it against external attack. The first signs of trouble appeared around mid-morning, when small groups of citizens began gathering in the streets surrounding the fortress. These initial crowds seemed more curious than threatening, consisting mainly of artisans, shopkeepers, and bourgeois citizens who had been drawn by rumors about potential violence. But as the morning progressed, the character of the crowd began to change, becoming larger, more agitated, and more explicitly hostile to the symbols of royal authority. By noon, several hundred people had assembled around the Bastille, their mood growing increasingly aggressive as speakers addressed them about the need to seize the weapons and ammunition stored within the fortress. The crowd included members of the Parisian militia, artisans from the surrounding neighborhoods, and political activists who had been organizing resistance to royal authority for months. Their immediate goal was practical. They needed gunpowder for the weapons they had seized from the invalids, but their symbolic purpose was far more significant. Governor Delaunay found himself in an impossible position. His instructions were to maintain security and protect royal property, but he lacked the military force necessary to disperse a crowd of this size and determination. Moreover, any aggressive action on his part risked escalating the situation and providing the crowd with a justification for violence that they might otherwise lack. He chose a cautious approach, refusing to admit the crowd, but avoiding any provocative actions that might precipitate an assault. The negotiations that took place throughout the early afternoon revealed the gulf between the crowd's expectations and the fortress's reality. The crowd's representatives demanded access to the gunpowder stores, the release of all prisoners, and the surrender of the fortress to popular authority. Delaunay responded that he lacked authority to make such decisions, that the prisoners were held under royal warrant and could only be released by proper authority, and that the fortress was royal property that he was obligated to defend. These negotiations might have continued indefinitely, but the crowd's patience was exhausted by the frustration of months of political tension and economic hardship. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a group of determined attackers managed to lower the fortress's outer drawbridge, allowing hundreds of people to surge into the outer courtyard. This breach transformed what had been a tense standoff into an active siege, with the fortress's defenders retreating to the inner courtyard and preparing for what they knew would be a desperate defense. The actual assault on the Bastille was a chaotic affair that bore little resemblance to the organized military operation depicted in later revolutionary art and literature. The attackers lacked siege equipment, military training, or coordinated leadership. They relied instead on courage, determination, and overwhelming numbers to compensate for their tactical disadvantages. The defenders, while better trained and equipped, were vastly outnumbered and fighting in a fortress that had not been designed to withstand assault by enemies. Already within its outer walls, the battle for the inner courtyard lasted approximately 4 hours and resulted in casualties. On both sides, contemporary accounts suggest that around 100 attackers were killed or wounded, while the fortress's defenders lost only 1 man before Delaunay made the decision to surrender. The disparity in casualties reflected the defenders' superior position and training, but also their reluctance to inflict massive casualties on fellow Frenchmen who were, in their view, misguided rather than truly treasonous. Imagine yourself walking through the marble halls of what had once been the Hôtel de Soubise, now serving as the residence of Citizen Barras, one of the 5 directors who governed France in the post-terror period. The building itself is a masterpiece of 18th century architecture, its rooms decorated with gilded moldings, crystal chandeliers, and tapestries that tell stories of classical mythology in threads of gold and silver. The irony is inescapable. A revolution that began by condemning such luxury has now placed its leaders in settings that rival the splendor of Versailles itself. Barras awakens each morning in a bedroom that had once belonged to a duke whose family had been intimate with royalty for centuries. The 4-poster bed is draped in silk that costs more than most French citizens earned in a year, and the room's windows look out over gardens maintained by a staff of 20 gardeners who have learned to address their new employer as citizen director rather than your grace. The furniture has been carefully retained, not because the revolution approves of such luxury, but because destroying it would be wasteful, and because the new elite has discovered that power requires appropriate settings for its exercise. The morning routine that Barras follows would have been familiar to the aristocrats who once occupied these same rooms. He is awakened by a valet, assisted with his toilette by servants who have learned to speak the language of revolutionary equality, while performing the same functions they had served under the old regime. His breakfast is served on porcelain that bears revolutionary symbols rather than royal arms, but the quality of the china and the elaborateness of the meal suggest that Republican simplicity has proven compatible with aristocratic comfort. Conversations that take place over this elegant breakfast reveal the complex psychology of revolutionary leadership in its mature phase. Barras and his associates discuss matters of state with the same casual authority that nobles once brought to questions of court protocol. They speak of managing public opinion, controlling political opposition, and maintaining the delicate balance between revolutionary principle and practical governance. The language is Republican, but the concerns are those that have occupied ruling elites throughout history. The transformation of these men from middle-class lawyers, merchants, and bureaucrats into a governing aristocracy had occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulation of small privileges and accommodations that seemed individually reasonable, but collectively amounted to the recreation of elite status. The process had begun with practical necessities. Revolutionary leaders needed appropriate housing, adequate security, and sufficient resources to carry out their responsibilities. But necessity had slowly expanded to include comfort, then luxury, and finally the kind of elaborate lifestyle that distinguished rulers from the wardrobes of these revolutionary leaders reflected this evolution with particular clarity. While they continued to wear the simple clothing that symbolized Republican virtue in public, their private apartments contained extensive collections of fine garments that would not have been out of place in the closets of pre-revolutionary nobles. The silk stockings, embroidered vests, and carefully tailored coats were justified as necessary for diplomatic functions and formal occasions. But they also reflected the natural human tendency of those with power to surround themselves with beautiful objects, the daily routine of revolutionary governance. took place in settings that dramatically contradicted the egalitarian principles that had launched the revolution. Cabinet meetings were held in rooms decorated with frescoes depicting allegorical scenes of justice and liberty, but the participants sat in chairs that had been crafted for princes and ate meals prepared by chefs who had learned their trade. In aristocratic kitchens, the contrast between revolutionary ideology and administrative reality created a cognitive dissonance that the new elite resolved through elaborate rationalizations about the temporary necessity of such arrangements. Justifications for this luxury were complex and often ingenious. Revolutionary leaders argued that France needed to maintain its dignity among European nations, that effective diplomacy required appropriate settings for entertaining foreign dignitaries, and that the Republic's authority would be undermined if its representatives appeared impoverished or uncivilized. These arguments had merit, but they also provided convenient cover for leaders who had discovered the pleasures of power and were reluctant to forego them in the name of abstract principle. The social life that developed around these revolutionary elites bore striking resemblances to the court culture that had once centered on Versailles. Salons emerged in the elegant drawing rooms of requisitioned mansions, where political leaders, intellectual figures, and wealthy citizens gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, and current events. The conversation was brilliant, the food was elaborate, and the clothing was expensive, just as it had been in the aristocratic salons of the Ancien regime. Madame Towing, wife of one of the prominent Thermidorian leaders, presided over one of the most influential of these salons from her apartments in a mansion that had once belonged to a family whose ancestors had served the crown for generations. She was known for her beauty, her intelligence, and her ability to create an atmosphere where political business could be conducted in settings of unprecedented elegance. Her evening receptions brought together the new republic's most powerful figures in surroundings that celebrated both classical culture and contemporary luxury. The guest lists for these gatherings revealed the social transformation that had accompanied the revolution's political changes. Former nobles who had managed to survive the terror by demonstrating republican loyalty mingled with newly wealthy merchants who had profited from confiscated aristocratic properties. Military officers who had risen from the ranks through revolutionary service conversed with intellectuals whose writings had shaped revolutionary ideology. Wealthy financiers who had learned to navigate the new political system shared tables with government officials whose decisions could affect the value of investments and the direction of policy. Entertainment at these social gatherings reflected the same combination of republican principle and aristocratic practice that characterized other aspects of revolutionary elite culture. The music performed was often classical, drawing on traditions that predated the revolution, but were now interpreted as expressions of universal human values rather than aristocratic taste. The art displayed on the walls had been liberated from royal collections and private aristocratic holdings, but its presence in revolutionary settings was justified as democratizing access to cultural treasures that had once been restricted to a privileged few. The economic arrangements that supported this lifestyle were as complex as they were controversial. Revolutionary leaders drew official salaries that were modest by contemporary standards, but they also had access to various perquisites and opportunities that greatly enhanced their effective income. Free housing in confiscated mansions, expense accounts for official entertaining, and investment opportunities arising from their political positions all contributed to a standard of living that far exceeded what their official compensation might suggest. That the moral compromises required to justify this lifestyle created psychological tensions that affected both the leaders themselves and the broader political culture of the Republic. Men who had once condemned aristocratic luxury as evidence of moral corruption now found themselves living in greater splendor than many of the nobles they had displaced. The rationalizations they developed to explain this apparent contradiction became increasingly elaborate, and increasingly divorced from the egalitarian principles that had originally motivated their political involvement. Joseph Fausch, who had risen from provincial obscurity to become one of the Republic's most powerful police officials, exemplified both the opportunities and the moral complexities of revolutionary careerism. His mansion in the Faubourg Saint-Honor was furnished with objects confiscated from enemies of the Republic, creating a private museum of aristocratic taste that he justified as proper utilization of resources that would otherwise be wasted. His servants were former employees of noble families who had learned to adapt their skills to Republican employers while maintaining the same standards of luxury and service. Fauch's daily routine included morning briefings from agents who monitored political opposition, afternoon meetings with subordinates who administered the complex apparatus of revolutionary surveillance, and evening entertainments that brought together the Republic's most influential figures in settings of unprecedented elegance. His conversations revealed the extent to which revolutionary leaders had become consumed with maintaining their own power rather than advancing the egalitarian goals that had originally justified their ascension to authority. The administrative apparatus that governed post-revolutionary France had grown into a bureaucracy that rivaled the complexity of the royal government it had replaced. Thousands of officials, clerks, and administrators worked in buildings that had once housed the machinery of royal authority, performing functions that were remarkably similar to those carried out under the Ancien regime. The language of administration had changed citizens rather than subjects, the Republic rather than the Crown, but the actual work of governing a large and complex society remained much the same. The offices where this bureaucratic work took place were often the same rooms that had served similar functions under the monarchy, furnished with the same desks, decorated with the same architectural details, and organized according to the same principles of hierarchy and specialization. Revolutionary symbols had replaced royal emblems, but the marble columns, gilded ceilings, and crystal chandeliers remained as testimony to the continuity of governmental power despite the radical transformation of its theoretical foundations. The men who staffed these offices represented a new kind of aristocracy, based on administrative competence rather than noble birth, but their lifestyle and social status were remarkably similar to those of their predecessors. They lived in comfortable apartments, ate elaborate meals, wore expensive clothing, and maintained social connections that reflected their position in the governmental hierarchy. The revolution had changed the criteria for advancement and the language of authority, but it had not eliminated the human tendency to create and maintain status distinctions. The foreign diplomatic community that operated in revolutionary Paris provided an external perspective on these transformations. It was both amused and concerned. Ambassadors and envoys who had once dealt with royal ministers now found themselves negotiating with Republican officials, whose living standards and social customs were virtually indistinguishable from those of their aristocratic predecessors. The substance of French power had remained largely intact, despite the revolutionary transformation of its forms and justifications. The evening diplomatic receptions held in requisition palaces were exercises in cultural translation, where representatives of monarchical governments attempted to conduct business with revolutionary leaders who insisted on republican protocol while enjoying aristocratic luxury. The conversations that took place in these elegant settings revealed the gap between revolutionary ideology and political reality, as practical considerations of statecraft gradually overwhelmed theoretical commitments to equality and simplicity. Military leadership that had emerged from the Revolution's wars represented another dimension of the new elite culture. Generals who had risen from the ranks through battlefield success now found themselves managing vast armies, administering conquered territories, and negotiating with foreign powers. Their headquarters were established in palaces and mansions that reflected their new status, while their personal lifestyles evolved to match the dignity of their positions and the requirements of their responsibilities. General Bonaparte, though still early in his career, was already demonstrating the pattern that would characterize revolutionary military leadership. His quarters were furnished with captured artworks and elegant furniture that reflected both his success in battle and his understanding of how power should be displayed. His staff included former aristocrats who had adapted to Republican service, wealthy civilians who sought association with military glory, and ambitious young officers who saw in Bonaparte's rise a model for their own advancement. The economic machinery that enabled the revolutionary elite's transformation from middle class idealists to luxury-dwelling aristocrats was both subtle and systematic, operating through mechanisms that allowed ambitious individuals to accumulate wealth and power while maintaining their public commitment to equality and republican virtue. The revolution had destroyed the old sources of aristocratic wealth, feudal obligations, royal pensions, inherited estates, but it had simultaneously created new opportunities for enrichment that were, in many ways, more lucrative and less regulated than the privileges they had replaced. Imagine yourself examining the financial records of Citizen Ouvrard, one of the Republic's most successful military contractors, whose modest origins as a provincial merchant's son had been transformed by revolutionary opportunity into a fortune that rivaled those of pre-revolutionary dukes. His offices, located in a mansion confiscated from an émigré nobleman, buzzed with activity as clerks processed contracts for supplying the Republic's armies with uniforms, weapons, food, and transport. The scale of these operations was staggering millions of livres in transactions that moved through his accounts each month, generating commissions and profits that accumulated with remarkable speed. Ouvrard's morning routine began with reviewing correspondence from military commanders across Europe who needed supplies for their campaigns, followed by meetings with government officials who awarded contracts and approved expenditures. The Revolutionary Wars had created an insatiable demand for military supplies, and those with the connections and capital necessary to meet this demand found themselves in positions to accumulate unprecedented wealth. The Republic's commitment to defending itself against foreign enemies had generated a military-industrial complex that enriched its participants on a scale that exceeded anything possible under the more limited warfare of the Ancien regime. Mechanisms of this enrichment were complex and often opaque, operating through networks of contracts, subcontracts, and financial arrangements that allowed savvy operators to extract profits at multiple levels of the supply chain. A single order for military uniforms might generate profits for the cloth manufacturer, the tailor who assembled the garments, the merchant who transported them to the army, and the financier who provided credit for the entire operation. Revolutionary officials who were positioned to influence these transactions could benefit through direct investment, preferential contract terms, or simple corruption that was difficult to detect and dangerous to investigate. The assignat currency system had created additional opportunities for financial manipulation that were largely invisible to the general population, but enormously profitable to those who understood how to exploit them. The paper money issued by the revolutionary government was backed by confiscated church and émigré properties, but its value fluctuated wildly based on political developments, military outcomes, and public confidence in the Republic's stability. Sophisticated investors who could predict these fluctuations, or who had access to information that allowed them to anticipate policy changes, could accumulate fortunes through currency speculation that was technically legal, but practically indistinguishable from insider trading. Jacques Recamier, whose banking house had become one of the Republic's most important financial institutions, exemplified the opportunities available to those who could navigate the complex intersection of politics and finance. His mansion in the Rue du Mont Blanc had been purchased with profits from transactions that involved converting assignats to gold, financing international trade, and providing credit to government departments that needed to make purchases before their budgets were approved. His wife Juliette presided over one of Paris's most elegant salons, where political leaders, literary figures, and wealthy merchants gathered in settings that celebrated both cultural sophistication and financial success. The confiscation, redistribution of émigré properties had created a massive transfer of wealth that benefited those with the political connections and financial resources necessary to participate in the auctions and private sales through which these assets were disposed of. Revolutionary leaders and their associates could acquire estates, urban properties, and valuable objects at prices far below their market value, either through direct purchase or through arrangements with intermediaries who bid on their behalf. The legal justification for these transactions was impeccable. The properties had been legitimately confiscated from enemies of the Republic, but the practical effect was to concentrate enormous wealth in the hands of the new political elite. The administrative apparatus required to manage these property transfers had grown into a substantial bureaucracy that provided employment opportunities for thousands of clerks, assessors, and officials whose salaries, while modest, were supplemented by fees, commissions, and informal arrangements that could significantly enhance their effective income. A position in the Bureau of National Properties might officially pay 3,000 livres annually, but the holder of such a position might accumulate additional wealth through advanced knowledge of upcoming sales, opportunities to acquire undervalued properties, or simple corruption that was difficult to prosecute given the complexity of the legal framework governing property transfers. The social networks that connected political power with economic opportunity were maintained through elaborate systems of mutual obligation and reciprocal benefit that operated largely outside formal governmental structures. A successful contractor might provide financial support for a politician's electoral campaigns, fund cultural events that enhanced the politician's reputation, or simply offer gifts and hospitality that created personal relationships conducive to future business arrangements. These networks were not necessarily corrupt in any legal sense, but they created a system where economic and political power reinforced each other in ways that effectively excluded those without access to substantial capital or influential connections. Lifestyle that these economic arrangements made possible was carefully calibrated to suggest republican virtue while enabling aristocratic comfort. Successful revolutionaries lived in elegant homes, but they justified their luxury as necessary for conducting the Republic's business with appropriate dignity. They wore expensive clothing, but they chose styles that avoided the most obvious displays of aristocratic fashion. They entertained lavishly, but they framed their hospitality as patriotic service to the Republic rather than personal indulgence. Citizen Tallien, whose rise from provincial lawyer to national political leader had been accompanied by his marriage to the beautiful and wealthy Teresa Cabarrus, demonstrated how personal relationships could facilitate both political advancement and economic success. Teresa's connections to international banking networks provided access to capital and investment, opportunities that would have been unavailable to someone of Tallien's modest origins, while his political position provided protection and preferential treatment for her financial ventures. Their joint household combined political influence with commercial success in ways that benefited both their public careers and their private wealth. The revolution's commitment to careers open to talent had indeed created unprecedented opportunities for social nobility, but the practical operation of this principle favored those who possessed not just ability, but also the cultural knowledge, social connections, and financial resources necessary to take advantage of the opportunities that revolutionary upheaval had created. A brilliant young man from a peasant family might theoretically rise to high position, but he would compete against equally brilliant young men from bourgeois families who possessed advantages of education, social polish, and family connections that were difficult to overcome through merit alone. The educational institutions that served the children of the revolutionary elite were designed to perpetuate these advantages across generations. The École Polytechnique, established to train engineers and military officers for Republican service, attracted students from wealthy families who could afford the preparatory education necessary for admission and the living expenses required for attendance. The education provided was excellent and technically meritocratic, but the social composition of the student body ensured that the benefits of this education would accrue primarily to those who were already privileged by family wealth and social position. The cultural institutions that flourished under Republican patronage reflected the same tension between democratic ideals and elite practice that characterized other aspects of revolutionary society. The Louvre, transformed from a royal palace into a public museum, was officially dedicated to democratizing access to art and culture, but its location, hours of operation, and informal social expectations effectively restricted its use to those with the leisure time, appropriate clothing, and cultural knowledge necessary to appreciate its collections. The working-class citizens in whose name the revolution had been fought were theoretically welcome, but practically excluded by barriers that were social and economic rather than legal. The legal framework governing these relationships was often inadequate to address their complexity, having been designed for simpler forms of corruption that involved direct exchanges of money for official favors. The sophisticated financial instruments, complex contractual arrangements, and elaborate social networks that characterized revolutionary elite culture operated in legal gray areas, where the boundaries between legitimate business activity and improper influence were difficult to define and impossible to police effectively. The provincial administration that governed France outside of Paris reflected the same patterns of elite formation and wealth accumulation that characterized the capital, but often with even less oversight and accountability. A successful administrator in Lyon or Marseille might accumulate wealth and power through the same mechanisms available to his Parisian counterparts, but with fewer competitors for the available opportunities and less scrutiny from central authorities, who were too distant to monitor local activities effectively. The revolutionary wars that had begun as defensive struggles against foreign invasion had evolved into campaigns of conquest that provided additional opportunities for enrichment through military contracting, territorial administration, and the exploitation of conquered populations. French generals and civilian administrators who governed occupied territories found themselves in positions to accumulate wealth through means that ranged from legitimate administrative salaries to outright plunder of enemy resources. The Directory government that ruled France after the Terror's end had established administrative systems that were theoretically designed to prevent corruption and ensure accountability. But these systems were often overwhelmed by the complexity of governing a nation at war and managing an economy disrupted by revolutionary upheaval. The result was a governmental apparatus that functioned adequately in most respects, but provided numerous opportunities for those who understood its weaknesses to benefit at public expense. The intellectual justifications that Republican theorists developed to explain these developments reflected sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing any attempt to create a more egalitarian society. They argued that some degree of inequality was inevitable in any complex society, that leadership required material incentives to attract talented individuals, and that the alternative to a Republican elite was not equality, but rather the restoration of monarchical aristocracy with its hereditary privileges and systematic exclusion of merit-based advancement. These theoretical arguments had merit, but they also provided convenient rationalizations for practical arrangements that served the interests of those who had gained power and wealth through revolutionary upheaval. The revolution had indeed created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility and had established principles of equality before the law that represented genuine advances in human political development. But it had also demonstrated the difficulty of translating egalitarian ideals into institutional arrangements that could resist the natural tendency of those with power to use it for their own advantage. By the winter of 1799, the contradictions inherent in revolutionary elite culture had reached a crisis point that would reshape not only French society, but the very meaning of revolution itself. The men and women who had risen to power through republican institutions were living lives of unprecedented luxury while governing a nation still committed, at least nominally, to the principles of equality and popular sovereignty. The tension between these realities had created a political atmosphere ripe for the kind of dramatic transformation that would soon arrive in the person of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose rise would resolve the revolution's contradictions by abandoning its democratic pretensions entirely. Imagine yourself attending one of the grand receptions held at the Luxembourg Palace, official residence of the Directory government, on a cold evening in early 1799. The palace itself is a monument to the revolution's transformation of aristocratic spaces into republican institutions. But the transformation has been more cosmetic than substantial. The same marble columns that once supported royal authority now frame revolutionary symbolism, while the same crystal chandeliers that illuminated monarchical ceremonies now light gatherings of republican officials, whose behavior differs little from that of their aristocratic predecessors. The evening's entertainment reflects the peculiar cultural synthesis that had emerged from the revolution's attempt to create new forms of elite sociability. The music performed includes both classical compositions that predate the revolution and newer works that celebrate republican themes, but the distinction between old and new has become largely academic. The audience consists of government officials, successful merchants, military officers, and cultural figures who have learned to appreciate both forms of musical expression as components of a refined lifestyle that transcends political categories. Conversations that take place in these elegant settings reveal the extent to which revolutionary leaders have developed a political vocabulary that allows them to discuss practical governance while maintaining rhetorical commitment to democratic principles. They speak of representing the people's will while making decisions that reflect elite interests, of defending republican virtue while enjoying aristocratic luxuries, of serving the common good while accumulating personal wealth that places them among the richest individuals in European society. Paul Barras, the most influential of the 5 directors, moves through these gatherings with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to wield power while maintaining the appearance of republican simplicity. His clothing is expensive, but not ostentatious. His manner is dignified, but not haughty, and his conversation is sophisticated, but not deliberately exclusionary. He has mastered the difficult art of appearing to be both a man of the people and a natural aristocrat, a combination that reflects the broader challenge facing all revolutionary leaders who must govern in the name of equality, while exercising authority that inevitably creates inequality. The practical challenges of governing. France had forced the Directory to make compromises with democratic theory that were justified as temporary necessities, but had become permanent features of the republican system. Universal suffrage had been replaced by property qualifications that effectively limited political participation to the wealthy and educated classes. Popular assemblies had been replaced by appointed bodies that were more amenable to elite control. The press had been subjected to censorship that was justified as protection against counter-revolutionary propaganda that served equally well to suppress criticism of governmental policies. These modifications to revolutionary democracy were explained through sophisticated theoretical arguments that drew on classical political philosophy, contemporary European precedents, and practical experience with the challenges of mass political participation. The Directory's supporters argued that pure democracy was unsuitable for a large and complex nation, that effective governance required educated and experienced leaders, and that the alternative to guided democracy was not popular rule, but rather chaos that would invite either monarchical restoration or foreign conquest. But beneath these theoretical justifications lay a simpler reality. The revolutionary elite had discovered that democratic principles, when implemented fully, threatened their ability to maintain the power and privilege they had acquired through revolutionary upheaval. Popular assemblies might vote to redistribute wealth, restrict commercial freedom, or hold officials accountable for their actions in ways that would undermine the elaborate arrangements through which the elite had enriched themselves. Constitutional limitations on democracy were therefore not just practical necessities, but existential requirements for the preservation of elite status. The military establishment that had grown up around the Revolutionary Wars provided both the most dramatic example of elite formation and the most serious challenge to civilian authority. Generals like Bonaparte, Jourdan, and Moreau had accumulated wealth, prestige, and independent power bases that rivaled those of the civilian leadership, while remaining formally subordinate to republican institutions. Their headquarters were established in palaces and mansions that reflected their new status. Their personal lifestyles had evolved to match the dignity of their positions, and their political influence had grown to the point where they could effectively dictate policy in areas affecting their interests. Relationship between these military commanders and the civilian government was complicated by the fact that both groups had emerged from the same revolutionary transformation and shared similar social backgrounds, cultural interests, and lifestyle preferences. The generals were not foreign conquerors or hereditary aristocrats, but former middle-class citizens who had risen through merit and opportunity in much the same way as their civilian counterparts. The potential for conflict between military and civilian authority was therefore not based on fundamental social or cultural differences, but on competing claims to represent the authentic spirit of the revolution, Bonaparte's rise to prominence. Within this military elite had been meteoric, but not anomalous. He represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the revolutionary period rather than a dramatic departure from established patterns. His victories in Italy had generated enormous wealth through the systematic exploitation of conquered territories. His headquarters in Milan and later in Egypt had been furnished with artistic treasures that rivaled the collections of European monarchs, and his personal entourage had grown to include scholars, artists, and administrators whose skills and social status enhanced his reputation as a patron of learning and culture. The political crisis that would bring Bonaparte to power was already evident in the Directory's inability to resolve the contradictions between its democratic legitimacy and its elite practice. Elections regularly produced results that threatened the interests of the governing class, leading to a series of coups and constitutional modifications that gradually undermined public faith in republican institutions. The Directory had become dependent on military force to maintain itself in power, creating a situation where civilian government existed only at the sufferance of military commanders who might withdraw their support at any moment. The cultural life of the late Directory period reflected these political tensions through its combination of unprecedented artistic freedom and subtle political constraints. Writers and artists could explore themes that had been forbidden under the monarchy and during the Terror, but they operated within a cultural environment that rewarded works, celebrating elite sophistication while discouraging productions that might inspire popular discontent with existing arrangements. The result was a flowering of cultural activity that was technically free, but practically oriented towards serving elite tastes and interests. The salon culture that had emerged in the mansions of Republican leaders provided venues for intellectual discussion that was more open than what had been possible under royal censorship, but more constrained than what democratic theory might suggest. Conversations could range freely over philosophical, literary, and even political topics, but participants understood that certain subjects, the growing inequality of Republican society, the concentration of wealth in elite hands, the gap between democratic theory and oligarchic practice were better left unexplored. Madame de Stael, whose salon had become one of the most influential gathering places for intellectual and political figures, exemplified both the opportunities and the limitations of cultural life under the Directory. Her writings could explore questions of individual freedom, social organization, and political legitimacy with a sophistication that would have been impossible under the Ancien regime. But her financial dependence on wealthy patrons and her social position within elite circles created subtle pressures to frame her analyses in ways that did not fundamentally challenge the interests of her audience. The economic arrangements that had enabled the revolutionary elite's rise were beginning to show signs of strain that threatened both the stability of the republic and the personal fortunes of its leaders. The assignat currency system had collapsed under the weight of overissue and public loss of confidence, creating a financial crisis that required new forms of taxation and monetary policy that were unpopular with both elite and popular constituencies. The confiscated properties that had provided opportunities for wealth accumulation were largely exhausted, forcing the elite to find new sources of enrichment through foreign conquest, commercial exploitation, or domestic economic manipulation. War economy that had sustained military contractors and government suppliers was becoming increasingly expensive and politically unsustainable as the costs of maintaining large armies and financing foreign campaigns began to exceed the benefits derived from conquest and plunder. The Directory faced growing pressure to negotiate peace with European powers, but peace would eliminate many of the opportunities for enrichment that had enabled elite formation while requiring economic adjustments that would threaten the living standards to which the revolutionary leadership had become accustomed. The social tensions created by the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and elite reality were manifesting themselves in various forms of popular discontent that threatened the stability of the Republican system. Urban workers who had supported the revolution in its early phases were becoming increasingly alienated from a government that spoke in their name, while serving interests that seemed fundamentally opposed to their own. Rural populations were growing restive under tax burdens that supported a governmental apparatus whose benefits appeared to flow primarily to urban elites. The religious question that had been temporarily resolved through the Concordat was beginning to resurface as popular attachment to traditional Catholic practices conflicted with the secular culture promoted by Republican elites. The revolutionary elite's complex relationship with religion privately maintaining traditional observances while publicly supporting secular institutions reflected their broader challenge of managing popular sentiment that remained attached to pre-revolutionary values and practices. The intellectual justifications that had been developed to explain elite privilege were becoming increasingly sophisticated, but also increasingly divorced from the democratic principles that had originally legitimized revolutionary government. Theorists like Benjamin Constant were beginning to develop arguments for limited democracy that would protect individual liberty and property rights, while restricting popular political participation in ways that would preserve elite autonomy. These theories were intellectually impressive, but they represented a fundamental departure from the egalitarian ideals that had motivated the revolution's early supporters. The foreign policy challenges facing the Directory were complicated by the extent to which Republican leaders had become dependent on foreign conquest for both political legitimacy and economic sustenance. The wars that had begun as defensive struggles against monarchical intervention had evolved into campaigns of expansion that were justified through appeals to revolutionary ideology but motivated primarily by the practical benefits they provided to the military and civilian elites who managed them. The corruption that had become endemic within Republican institutions was reaching levels that threatened governmental effectiveness while providing ammunition for political opponents who argued that Republican government was inherently unstable and incompetent. Scandals involving military contracts, property speculation, and abuse of official position were becoming too numerous and too blatant to ignore, creating demands for reform that conflicted with the interests of those who possessed the power. To implement changes, the electoral system that was supposed to provide democratic legitimacy for Republican government had been so modified by constitutional amendments, property qualifications, and manipulation that it no longer served its theoretical function of representing popular will. Elections were becoming contests between different factions of the elite rather than meaningful choices between alternative approaches to governance, leading to growing popular cynicism about the value of political participation. The approaching crisis was visible to perceptive observers who understood that the Directory's combination of democratic rhetoric and oligarchic practice was inherently unstable and would eventually be resolved either through genuine democratization or through the abandonment of democratic pretensions entirely. The revolutionary elite had created a system that was too unequal to satisfy democratic expectations, but too unstable to provide the security that elite interests required. Bonaparte's eventual coup would resolve these contradictions by establishing a system that abandoned democratic legitimacy in favor of meritocratic authoritarianism that could provide both elite security and popular satisfaction through military glory and efficient administration. The empire that emerged from the Directory's collapse would represent not the betrayal of revolutionary principles, but their logical culmination. A system where careers were indeed open to talent, where efficiency and competence were rewarded, and where the contradictions between equality and excellence were resolved through the subordination of political freedom to administrative effectiveness. The tragedy of the Directory period was not that it failed to create a perfect democracy, but that it demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining democratic institutions in a society where revolutionary upheaval had created new forms of inequality that were potentially more destabilizing than those they had replaced. The revolutionary elite had succeeded in displacing aristocratic privilege, but had failed to create sustainable alternatives that could reconcile democratic legitimacy with effective governance. The luxury and sophistication that characterized elite culture during this period were not simply evidence of corruption or betrayal of revolutionary ideals, but rather reflections of the natural human tendency to use power and wealth to create beautiful and meaningful environments. The problem was not that successful revolutionaries lived well, but that they lived well while governing in the name of people whose own living standards had improved little since the revolution's beginning. The historical significance of this period lies not in its specific successes or failures, but in its demonstration of the challenges facing any society that attempts to combine democratic government with complex economic and social organization. The Directory's experience revealed tensions between equality and excellence, between popular will and expert knowledge, between democratic legitimacy and administrative efficiency that would continue to challenge democratic societies for generations. To come. As 1799 drew to a close, the stage was set for the dramatic transformation that would resolve these tensions through the abandonment of democratic government in favor of authoritarian efficiency. The revolutionary elite had created the conditions for their own supersession by demonstrating that republican institutions, as they had implemented them, could neither satisfy popular expectations nor provide elite security. The solution would come not from democratic reform, but from military dictatorship that would preserve elite privilege while providing the order and stability that both popular and elite constituencies had come to value more than freedom itself. As we reach the end of our journey through the streets of revolutionary Paris, through the chambers where Robespierre planned his final speeches, through the stones and myths of the Bastille, and through the elegant salons where a new aristocracy learned to reconcile luxury with republican virtue, we return to the question: That began our exploration. Why wouldn't you have survived the French Revolution, even if you agreed with its ideals? The answer, as we have seen, lies not in the revolution's goals, but in its methods. Not in its destination, but in its journey. Not in what it promised, but in what it required of those who lived through its transformation of French society. The revolution that began with the noble aspiration of creating a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity evolved into something far more complex and far more dangerous, a political system where survival depended not on the content of your beliefs, but on your ability to navigate an ever-changing landscape of acceptable thought and behavior. Consider the ordinary Parisian whose daily life we shared during the Terror. This citizen supported the revolution's goals, cheered the fall of the Bastille, and approved of the king's execution. Yet he found himself trapped in a web of surveillance and suspicion that made every conversation a potential denunciation, every friendship a possible conspiracy, every expression of doubt a sign of counter-revolutionary sympathy. His beliefs aligned perfectly with revolutionary principles, but his survival required not sincerity, but performance, not conviction, but caution, not truth, but the ability to present the right truth at the right time to the right audience. The tragedy of Robespierre himself illustrates this paradox with crystalline clarity. No one was more committed to revolutionary virtue, more dedicated to the cause of creating a just society, more willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the common good. Yet these very qualities, his unwavering commitment to principle, his refusal to compromise with human weakness, his determination to purify French society of all corruption, became the instruments of his destruction. The revolution consumed him not because he betrayed its ideals, but because he embodied them too completely for the comfort of those around him. The Bastille story reveals another dimension of this complexity. The fortress that symbolized royal tyranny turned out to house not torture, chambers and political martyrs, but comfortable quarters and unfortunate debtors. The revolutionaries who stormed its walls expected to find dramatic evidence of oppression. That would vindicate their courage and justify their violence. Instead, they discovered the more subtle truth that political symbols can be more powerful than political realities, that the meaning of an institution can matter more than its actual function, that the stories we tell about power can be more significant than the ways power is actually exercised at, and in the elegant mansions where revolutionary leaders learned to live like aristocrats while speaking the language of equality. We see the final irony of revolutionary transformation. The revolution succeeded in destroying the old elite, but could not prevent the formation of a new one. It eliminated hereditary privilege, but created merit-based advantage that proved equally exclusive. It promised equality, but delivered a different kind of hierarchy, one based on political virtue rather than noble birth, but no less real in its effects on those excluded from its benefits. These contradictions were not accidental failures of revolutionary leadership, but inevitable consequences of the revolution's attempt to transform human nature through political action. The revolution promised to create new kinds of human beings, citizens motivated by virtue rather than self-interest, officials dedicated to the common good rather than personal advancement, a society where merit would triumph over birth and justice over privilege. But the revolutionaries themselves remained human beings, subject to the same temptations, limitations, and weaknesses that had characterized their predecessors. The Terror emerged not from sadistic cruelty, but from the logical application of revolutionary principles to the messy realities of governing a complex society during wartime. If virtue was the foundation of Republican government, then vice became not just morally wrong, but politically treasonous. If equality was the goal of revolutionary transformation, then any expression of superior status became evidence of counter-revolutionary sympathy. If the people's will was sovereign, then opposition to popular government became a crime against the nation itself. The revolutionaries created a political system where good intentions were not enough, where supporting the right causes provided no protection against accusations of insufficient dedication, where the gap between public profession and private thought became a matter of life and death. They demanded not just obedience but enthusiasm, not just compliance but conversion, not just acceptance but active participation in the ongoing work of social transformation. This demand for total commitment created the psychological atmosphere that made the revolution so dangerous for its own supporters. Citizens could not simply agree with revolutionary principles. They had to demonstrate their agreement through constant vigilance against the revolution's enemies. Regular attendance at political gatherings, appropriate emotional responses to patriotic celebrations, and willingness to denounce anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable. The revolution required not just political support, but spiritual conversion, not just changed behavior, but transformed consciousness. Yet even this transformation was insufficient to guarantee survival, because the revolution's definition of virtue kept expanding, its standards of political correctness kept rising, and its identification of enemies kept broadening. What was acceptable behavior in 1789 became suspicious in 1792 and treasonous by 1794. Citizens, who had been celebrated as heroes in the revolution's early phase, found themselves denounced as false patriots in its later stages. Revolutionary leaders who had risked everything to overthrow the monarchy discovered that their past services provided no protection against present suspicions. The revolution's leaders found themselves trapped in the same dynamic that ensnared ordinary citizens. Their authority depended on their reputation for virtue, but virtue was defined by the revolution's current needs rather than consistent principles. Robespierre's downfall came not when he violated revolutionary principles, but when he applied them so rigidly that other revolutionaries began to fear for their own safety. His commitment to virtue became a threat to those whose own virtue was less absolute, less consistent, less dangerous to their colleagues. The economic and social transformations that accompanied the revolution's political changes created additional sources of instability and danger. The confiscation of church and aristocratic properties, the collapse of traditional social hierarchies, and the emergence of new forms of wealth and status created opportunities for some while threatening others. Citizens who benefited from these changes had reason to support the revolution, but they also had reason to fear that further changes might eliminate their newfound advantages. Those who lost status or property had obvious motives for opposition, but their resentment made them dangerous to revolutionary security. The war that dominated much of the revolutionary period intensified all these pressures by creating a siege mentality where internal enemies seemed as threatening as foreign armies. Military necessity justified extraordinary measures. Patriotic unity became a survival requirement, and any expression of doubt about war policy could be interpreted as aid to enemy forces. The revolution's external struggles made its internal purification seem more urgent, its demands for loyalty more reasonable, and its elimination of suspected traitors more necessary. The cultural revolution that accompanied political transformation created another layer of complexity for those trying to navigate revolutionary society. Citizens had to learn new vocabularies, new rituals, new forms of social interaction that demonstrated their commitment to Republican values. They had to abandon customs and traditions that were now considered counter-revolutionary while embracing practices that showed proper revolutionary consciousness. The revolution demanded not just political conversion, but cultural transformation that touched every aspect of daily life. Perhaps most fundamentally, the revolution failed to provide clear, consistent guidance about what behavior would ensure survival, because its own understanding of virtue and vice, friend and enemy, acceptable and dangerous, was constantly evolving. Citizens who successfully adapted to one phase of revolutionary development found themselves unprepared for the next phase, which might require different behaviors, different loyalties, different expressions of political commitment. The tragedy of the French Revolution was not that it failed to achieve its goals. It did, in fact, transform French society in profound and lasting ways, but that it achieved them through methods that made survival a matter of luck as much as virtue, chance, as much as principle, political skill, as much as sincere commitment. The revolution created a society where you could believe in all the right things and still end up on the scaffold, where supporting the cause of freedom could lead to the loss of your own freedom, where dedication to equality could result in your elimination by those who claim to represent the people's will. This is why you wouldn't have survived the French Revolution, even if you agreed with it completely. Survival required not just the right beliefs, but the right timing, not just proper principles, but practical wisdom, not just sincere conviction, but sophisticated understanding of political dynamics that changed faster than most people could adapt. The revolution demanded more than human beings could reasonably be expected to provide: perfect virtue, unwavering loyalty, constant vigilance, and the ability to anticipate changes in political orthodoxy that even the revolution's leaders could not predict. As you settle into the comfort of your own bed tonight, in a world where political disagreement rarely leads to physical danger, where privacy is largely respected, where friendship is not considered a form of conspiracy, reflect on the extraordinary demands that revolutionary transformation placed on ordinary human beings. The French Revolution's legacy includes not just the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that continue to inspire democratic movements, but also a sobering reminder of how difficult it can be to translate those ideals into stable institutions that protect rather than threaten those they claim to serve. The revolution's story is ultimately a human story, filled with the same mixtures of nobility and weakness, idealism and ambition, courage and fear that characterize all human endeavors. Its participants were neither saints nor monsters, but people much like ourselves, trying to create a better world while struggling with limitations that no political system can entirely overcome. Their failures teach us as much as their successes. Their tragedies illuminate truths as important as their triumphs. Sleep well in your peaceful present, grateful for the distance that time and circumstance provide between your life and theirs, but mindful of the fragility of the institutions that protect your freedoms and the vigilance required to preserve them against the eternal human temptations of power, fear, and the desire to perfect an imperfect world through imperfect means.